Welcome to Demon Sleep. I'm here to help you unwind tonight. If you enjoy this space, feel free to like and subscribe. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. It makes this feel like a shared night across the world. These stories are different, and I'm glad you're here. Dim the lights, let the room settle, and let's begin. Story 1: What the Flesh Remembers. Nobody chooses a moment like that. Nobody wakes up and decides, today is the day everything changes. But that's exactly what happened on a gray Thursday in late autumn, when a stranger appeared at the end of a long, forgotten road. And what unfolded next would never be undone. The doctor saw him first. Not in the way you'd expect, not through a hospital corridor or a crowded waiting room. No, he saw him standing at the edge of a highway, half swallowed by fog, one hand raised to the passing cars. A gesture so worn down, so rehearsed by years of survival, that it barely carried weight anymore. It was less a plea and more a reflex. The kind of motion a body makes when it has long stopped believing anyone will stop. But the doctor did stop. His name doesn't matter yet. What matters is this. He was a man broken open by something the world doesn't talk about easily. Grief. Real, corrosive grief. The kind that changes the shape of your face, hollows out the architecture of your days, and makes you see ghosts in the features of every stranger you pass on the street. And when the young man turned toward the car, when their eyes met through the cold, rain-smeared glass, the doctor felt something crack open inside his chest. Something sharp, something familiar. The line of the jaw, the angle of the brow, a bone structure that lived not in his memory but somewhere deeper, somewhere in the marrow. He pushed the feeling down, buried it. Not again, he told himself. Grief had a cruel talent for projection. It had made him see his son's face in crowds, in photographs, in the silhouettes of men who shared nothing but the most passing resemblance. This was no different. He reached over and unlocked the door. The young man climbed in without a single question. And that silence told the doctor everything. A person with options in this world interrogates kindness. They ask why, they weigh the risk, they hesitate. But a person stripped of options, a person who has spent months, maybe years, sleeping under overpasses and eating what the discarded world leaves behind. That person accepts help the way a drowning man accepts a piece of driftwood, without gratitude, without suspicion, simply because the alternative is the water. The road climbed. Narrow at first, then gradually widening, the trees pressing in from both sides, ancient maples. Their branches black and bare against a white sky, closing over the car like fingers lacing together. And then, without warning, they fell away. And the house revealed itself. It sat at the end of the road like something from another century, which in many ways it was. A grand, symmetrical structure, all stone and tall windows, and an architecture that suggested not warmth but control. Balance that had been enforced, not earned. A place designed to impose order on the landscape around it. The kind of house that watched you back. What lived inside it, though, what had been built inside its bones, was something no one on the outside could have guessed. The room had once been a conservatory. Glass walls, southern light pouring in like a slow, golden tide. But that warmth had been replaced methodically, precisely, with something colder. Steel surfaces, surgical lamps that hummed with a quiet, artificial intensity. Machines that blinked and pulsed in rhythms that mimicked life, monitoring it, translating it into numbers and sound. This was an operating room, a private one, and it had taken years to build. Not because the equipment was difficult to acquire, though it was. You cannot simply walk into a medical supply store and purchase what this room contained. No licenses, no oversight, no trail. The doctor had spent 2 decades assembling it, piece by piece, instrument by instrument, sourcing components from corners of the world where money spoke louder than questions, where generous payments bought a silence that no contract could guarantee. The monitoring systems alone were a masterwork of paranoid precision, automated systems that delivered anesthesia in measured, calculated doses, redundant alarms layered over redundant alarms, vital signs displayed in real time, accompanied by audio alerts that would scream if anything drifted from the narrow corridor of acceptable. A camera mounted overhead, recording every movement, every incision, every decision, so the doctor could review his own hands later, in private, alone. He understood the limitations of working without a team. He understood them the way a tightrope walker understands the wind, not as an abstraction, as a constant, lived reality, something he felt in his hands every single time he stepped beneath those lights. But here is what the young man did not know, could not know, as he sat quietly in the passenger seat, watching the countryside blur past the window. The doctor had not stopped for him out of kindness. Not entirely. He had stopped because something in that face, something in the geometry of that silence, had touched a wound that had never fully closed. And the doctor, brilliant and meticulous and utterly, devastatingly alone, had decided, in the space between one breath and the next, that this stranger was worth keeping close. The question was never whether the young man would stay. The question was what the doctor intended to do with him, once he did. The doctor knew what he was reaching for. He knew it lived at the very edge of what one pair of hands could accomplish, a boundary that no textbook had drawn but that every surgeon understood instinctively, the way a pilot understands the sky. A single operator cannot become a team, cannot split attention, cannot hold a wound open while simultaneously closing another. It is, by every measure that matters, impossible. But the doctor had something that teams rarely possessed: time. Not the clipped, pressured hours of an emergency room, not the scheduled windows of a hospital operating theater. He had days, weeks even. He could work in stages, open a door, then close it, then wait. Let the body heal between visits. Let the tissue knit itself back together before he returned to pull it apart again. It was slower than anything performed under fluorescent lights and sterile protocols. It was also, in its own strange way, more precise. Each stage planned. Each recovery mapped. Each variable cataloged and accounted for like entries in a ledger only he would ever read. Risk to him was not a wall. It was a weather system. Something to be read, predicted, navigated. Never eliminated but managed. And management in this house was the only language spoken. He prepared the medication while the boy wandered. That was the word for it, wandered. Not exploring exactly, not with curiosity. More like drifting through the rooms the way water finds its level, drawn not by interest but by gravity. The young man's fingers moved across the spines of books he couldn't read, trailing across leather and cloth like a blind man reading a landscape. His touch left faint oils on the covers, small, invisible marks of presence in a house that had seen almost none for years. One shelf stopped him. Not the books, the music, a leather-bound collection of nocturnes, the pages dense with notation, and covered in the margins in a hand that was not the doctor's, with small, precise annotations. A son's handwriting. A boy who had sat in this very room, in this very chair, and turned these pages under lamplight, filling the silence between the notes with his own quiet thinking. The doctor watched from the doorway. His hands, steady enough to hold a blade, had begun to tremble. He had prepared the tea before the boy arrived at the shelf. Earl Grey loose leaf, steeped longer than most would tolerate, poured into a cup that had belonged to Sebastian. The choice was not accidental. Nothing in this house was accidental. The boy accepted it without comment, the way he had accepted the ride, the way he had accepted the warmth and the roof and the quiet. He drank it in long, unhurried swallows, 4 of them. The cup was empty before the doctor had finished watching. 8 minutes. That was how long it took. 8 minutes for the medication folded into the tea to find its way through the bloodstream and reach the place where thought lies. The boy's pupils, dark, already exhausted, swelled wider, swallowing the color around them. His shoulders, which had been carrying the weight of months on the road, dropped an inch, then 2. His body softened the way snow softens before it falls, not all at once, but with a slow, irreversible surrendering. He tried to stand. His legs did not cooperate. They folded beneath him, not with the dramatic collapse of someone falling, but with a quiet, mechanical failure, like a structure whose foundations had simply been removed. The gurney received him with a low, pneumatic exhale, as though the room itself had been waiting. The restraints went on in silence, wrists first, then ankles, then the broad strap across the chest, firm, deliberate, not cruel, functional. The doctor moved with the economy of someone who had rehearsed this choreography 100 times in his mind before performing it once with his hands. And through all of it, the boy's eyes stayed open. That was the cruelest part of ketamine, the part the textbooks mentioned in clinical language and the body experienced as something close to horror. The mind was still there, still watching, still registering on some dim, flickering level what was happening and to whom. But the connection between knowing and acting had been severed. Thought arrived without the ability to become movement. Awareness pooled behind glass. The boy could see the doctor moving above him, could feel distantly the cold air on his skin, could understand somewhere beneath the fog that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. He simply could not do anything about it. The photographs were placed with intention. 3 of them, arranged on the instrument tray beside the surgical tools, angled so that a person lying on the table, eyes open, unable to look away, would see them. The first, a boy of 12, a face still round with childhood, still carrying the softness that hadn't yet been carved away by adolescence. But even then, even in that early, unfinished version of the person, the bone structure was there, waiting beneath the surface like something wanting to emerge. The second, 16, the softness gone, replaced by something sharper, colder, more alive. A face that cut the air around it. The kind of intelligence that made rooms uncomfortable, that made people shift in their seats without knowing why. Insufferable, the doctor had once called it, in a voice that carried something far heavier than criticism. The third photograph was the last one taken. July 17th. The date lived in the doctor's body the way a bullet lives in flesh long after the wound has closed, not visible from the outside, but always felt. A morning photograph. Light coming through a window. A face turned slightly away as though already beginning to leave. And then nothing. The thread cut. The silence that followed was the kind that reshapes a life around its absence. The doctor placed the final photograph where the boy's fixed, dilated gaze would find it first. Then he lifted the blade. The first incision was small, exploratory, a word that sounded almost gentle, almost curious for what it actually meant. A narrow opening along the jawline, just deep enough to let the doctor's fingertips feel what lay beneath the skin. Tissue quality, bone density, the architecture of a face that nature had built and that he now intended to rebuild from the inside out. His hand did not shake. This was the paradox that had followed him since the hearing, since the board had stripped him of everything, since the word revoked had been spoken in a room full of people who would never understand what he had been trying to accomplish. Since that day, a tremor had lived in his right hand, faint, persistent, present in the mornings when he reached for a coffee cup, in the evenings when he turned the pages of a book. A reminder, written in the language of the body, of what he had lost. But the moment steel met skin, it vanished. As though the blade were an extension of something the tremor could not reach. Some deeper, older steadiness that predated grief, that predated loss, that had been forged in decades of standing in operating rooms and trusting his hands to do what his mind commanded. The boy made a sound as the scalpel opened the first line. Not a word, not quite a cry, something between, a vibration pulled from somewhere below language, below thought. The kind of sound a body makes when it registers violation before the mind has fully processed it. Blood welled up, dark against the pale landscape of skin, slow, welling alive. The doctor's fingers found the jawline beneath, traced it, followed the ridge and the curve and the blunt, heavy set of it. He held the shape in his mind the way a sculptor holds the absence of a form, seeing not what was there but what was missing. The jaw was too wide, too square, too much of what the world would call ordinary. Sebastian's jaw had been something else entirely, refined, narrow, aristocratic in a way that suggested not wealth but genetics, something deeper, something inherited from ancestors whose faces had been drawn by finer hands than nature usually allowed. He worked for 3 hours mapping the distance between what existed and what he needed to create. 3 hours of careful, unhurried excavation, measuring, cataloging, building in his mind the blueprint of a transformation that would take weeks, maybe months to complete. Each cut a question, each measurement an answer. The boy lay still beneath him, breathing in the slow, mechanical rhythm that the medication imposed, eyes open and seeing everything and able to change nothing. And then, somewhere in the space between one breath and the next, somewhere in that thin, translucent corridor where consciousness dissolves and something stranger begins, the boy's lips moved. Not a cry, not a moan, something smaller, something that required the doctor to lean in close, to bring his ear almost to the boy's mouth, to hold his own breath so that the sound barely there, barely human, could reach him. A word or the ghost of one. The doctor listened, and what he heard, the word that left his lips, was not a name the doctor recognized. Hartford or something close to it, a place maybe, or a fragment of one. The kind of half-formed sound a mind produces when it is surfacing from deep water, grasping at anything solid enough to hold. And then a second later something softer. A woman's name, Linda perhaps, or Belinda. The syllables carried no weight, no context, no map back to a life the doctor had no interest in charting. They were noise, static from a signal that was breaking up. He noted it anyway, not out of sentiment, out of protocol. A mind that surfaced with that kind of fragmentation, that produced sounds detached from meaning, names detached from faces, was a mind worth watching. Traumatic brain injury lived in precisely that kind of wreckage. The doctor filed it away in the same place he filed everything, quietly, precisely, and with the intention of returning to it later. Then he closed the wound. Black silk, threaded through a needle so fine it was almost invisible, a material chosen not for its beauty but for its properties, the way it held, the way it disappeared into the body's landscape once healing began. 7 stitches, each one placed with a care that bordered on reverence not for the boy, but for the work. When the last suture was drawn tight and the silk was trimmed, The doctor set down his instruments and looked at what he had begun. The boy's face had already started to change. Not dramatically, not yet, but enough that someone paying close attention would have noticed a subtle shift in the topography of his features. Swelling had begun its slow, anonymous work, rounding the edges, softening the lines, blurring the boundary between what this face had been and what it was in the process of becoming. It was neither one thing nor the other. A face caught mid-transformation, a chrysalis with a heartbeat. The recovery room had once belonged to Sebastian. The doctor had not changed everything. That would have been too clean, too final, a kind of erasure he was not yet willing to commit. Instead, he had stripped the room of most of what made it lived in. The desk was gone, the bookshelves cleared, the posters, the clothes, the small accumulated debris of a young man's existence, all of it packed away or quietly discarded. What remained was sparse, deliberate. A four-poster bed, its dark wood frame standing in the center of the room like an altar. A nightstand beside it, and in the single drawer of that nightstand, a pair of reading glasses that still carried the faint impression of a nose that no longer existed. The doctor did not look at the glasses. He did not need to. Their presence was enough. He transferred the boy from the gurney to the mattress while the medication still held the body compliant, while the mind was still somewhere else, still wandering in that gray, painless space where resistance is impossible. The hospital-grade restraints went on with practiced efficiency. Nylon and metal, padded where skin met strap, firm enough to hold but designed not to bruise. A harness for the unconscious, a cage for the waking. The doctor pulled the green velvet chair, Sebastian's chair, the one that had always sat angled toward the window to catch the afternoon light, into position beside the bed, and he waited. It took longer than expected for the boy to surface. When his eyes finally opened, truly opened, not the glazed, mechanical flutter of someone still under, the first thing they did was search. Scan the room, the ceiling, the walls, the unfamiliar architecture of a space that belonged to no version of his life. And then they found the doctor, sitting perfectly still in the green chair, hands folded, watching with an expression that gave nothing away. The boy's mouth moved. It was his first conscious act, this impulse to speak, to break the silence, to assert through sound that he was still present, still himself, still a person with a name and a history and a claim on the world. But the swelling had done its work. The jaw, the tissue around it, the delicate machinery of speech, all of it was compromised. What emerged was not a word. It was an approximation, a shape that the mouth tried to make and the body would not allow. His second act was to pull against the restraints. Not frantically, not yet. A single quiet test, the way an animal tests a fence before deciding whether to fight it or accept it. The nylon held. The metal did not give. The boy pulled again, harder this time, and something behind his eyes shifted, a flicker of understanding that was worse, somehow, than panic. The beginning of a realization that the cage was real. The doctor watched all of this without moving. He was reading the boy's mouth. Not the words, there were no words, not yet, but the shapes, the phonemes, the way the lips pressed and released, the way the tongue pushed against teeth that could not quite cooperate. His medical training allowed him to do this the way a linguist reads a dead language, by pattern, by structure, by the ghost of meaning that persisted even when the sound itself had been destroyed. The boy was trying to say a name. Not Sebastian, not any name the doctor knew. Something else entirely, a string of sounds that might have been Rooker or Tucker, something hard and blunt and his. An identity he was trying to hold onto with the desperate grip of a man clinging to a ledge. The doctor noted it. Clinical language came easily in moments like this, a buffer between the act and the feeling that accompanied it. Patient attempting verbal assertion of prior identity, predictable resistance phase, words that turned a person into a case, a process into a protocol. He wrote them down in the small notebook he kept in his jacket pocket, the same way he recorded everything, precisely, without sentiment, and with no intention of ever sharing them with anyone alive. The boy thrashed for 11 minutes. The doctor timed it. Not out of cruelty, though it may have looked like cruelty from the outside, if anyone had been there to see it. Out of data. Duration of resistance was a variable. It told him things about the boy's physical condition, his pain threshold, the depth of his psychological attachment to the life he was being taken from. 11 minutes was longer than expected. It suggested a mind that was not yet ready to let go, a self that was still fighting, still insisting on its own existence with every contraction of muscle and every desperate pull against the restraints. When exhaustion finally took him, when the body simply ran out of the fuel required to keep fighting, the doctor moved. He checked the sutures first, ran his fingertips along the line of the incision with a gentleness that would have seemed to an observer almost tender, looking for separation, for tearing, for any sign that the violence of the boy's resistance had undone what his hands had so carefully constructed. It had not. The silk held, the wound held, the chrysalis was intact. Then he administered the morphine. Through the IV line that had been placed before the boy woke, a thin, transparent thread connecting the body to a bag of fluid that hung above the bed like a glass moon. The dosage was precise, enough to blunt the sharp edge of pain, enough to let the boy drift, to soften the hard corners of what was happening to him, but not enough to disappear, not enough to drift fully into that warm, dark place where nothing hurt and nothing mattered. This was intentional. The boy needed to stay present, needed to feel the weight of his own body on this bed, in this room, in this house that was not his, needed to remain tethered to the experience of what was being done to him, not out of sadism, but out of a conviction the doctor held as deeply as any belief, that transformation required awareness, that a person could not be remade if the person was not, on some level, still there to be remade. In the days that followed, the doctor built a world. Not a life, not yet. A structure. A set of rules and rhythms and repetitions that would govern everything that happened inside this house, from the moment the sun came up to the moment it disappeared. Protocols. The word the doctor used because it sounded like medicine, like science, like something rational and controlled, and not at all like what it actually was, which was something closer to choreography, a dance with only one partner willing. Every morning at 8 o'clock, the boy was moved. The pulley system had been installed months before the boy arrived, bolted into the ceiling joists, threaded with cable and counterweights, designed to allow a single person to lift and transport a human body without assistance. It was ungraceful, mechanical, the kind of engineering that belonged in a warehouse, not a bedroom that had once held a teenager's dreams. But it worked, and working in this house was the only thing that mattered. The gurney carried him to the surgical suite. The lights came on, bright, shadowless, merciless, and beneath them, the doctor conducted his examinations and executed his plans with the patience and precision of someone who had spent an entire lifetime preparing for exactly this. The nose came first. Sebastian's nose had been a small, elegant thing, narrow at the bridge, straight, refined in a way that suggested it had been drawn rather than grown. A face built by genetics that favored symmetry, that produced features which other faces envied without being able to name why. The boy's nose was something else entirely. broken, at least twice, maybe more. Each fracture poorly set, the bone healing crooked, the cartilage shifting and settling into a shape that bore no relation to what it had been before the first break. A nose that told a story the doctor had no interest in reading. A history written in violence and neglect, and the kind of carelessness that happens when no one is paying attention. He broke it again. Not with rage, not with punishment, with control. A single calculated strike force applied to bone at precisely the angle required to fracture it cleanly, to reset the architecture from the inside. The sound it made was small, quieter than you would expect. A click more than a crack. The boy, still restrained, still drifting in the shallow waters of morphine, flinched, a full body contraction that rippled through the straps and the bed and the silence of the room. And then the doctor reached for the x-rays. Not the boy's, Sebastian's. A series of them taken years ago during a routine medical examination. Images of bone and cartilage and the invisible internal geometry of a face that no longer existed. Photographs of an absence, rendered in light and shadow. The doctor held them up beside the boy's face the way an artist holds a reference beside a canvas, comparing, measuring, calculating the distance between what was and what needed to be. The blueprint was precise. The work had only just begun. The water ran red. Not pink, not a faint blush swirling down the drain. Red. And the man standing over that sink, the man who had just spent 11 hours reshaping a child's face with his own trembling hands, didn't flinch. He just watched it disappear. That's where this story begins. Not at the beginning. At the moment, everything was already too far gone to turn back. His name was Cresswell. And what he did that night, alone, in silence, with no one to catch him if he failed, is one of the most quietly devastating acts of desperate love you will ever hear. He had mapped the entire procedure in advance. Every cut, every graft, every second of the 11 hours it would take. The cartilage came from the boy's own ribs, harvested, shaped, and rebuilt into a brand new structure for his face. A scaffold made from the child's own body. Cresswell had done this alone. No team, no safety net. Just him, a surgical table, and a faith so stubborn it bordered on madness. The anesthesia system was automated. Cresswell had calibrated it himself, oxygen levels, heart rate, blood pressure, all of it feeding into a quiet hum of alarms he had tuned to his own breathing rhythm. Every 15 minutes he stopped, checked the numbers, made sure the boy was still there. That was the price of doing this alone, not speed, not confidence, constant grinding vigilance. Every pause a reminder that one wrong second could end everything. And then, before the anesthesia fully took hold, the boy screamed. Even muffled, even restrained, the sound filled the room like something breaking. Cresswell didn't stop. He couldn't, he kept going. When it was over, he walked to the sink. 11 hours of blood washing off his fingers in slow, quiet waves. The water turned pink, then clear, and then in that mirror he saw something that stopped him cold. It wasn't his face looking back. It was the boy's. No, not the boy. Someone older. Someone whose expression Cresswell knew in his bones. A look of quiet, permanent disappointment. A scowl that had been carved into place by years of silence and distance. The kind of face that says, "I expected better from you," without ever opening its mouth. Sebastian. Cresswell blinked, and just like that his own reflection, tired, bloodshot, human again. He told himself it was exhaustion. 11 hours without rest. The psychological weight of holding someone's life in his hands while simultaneously keeping them under. A hallucination, nothing more. He dried his hands, folded the towel, went back to check the boy's vitals. Because the work wasn't done. It never is. By the third morning, the fever arrived like something that had been waiting. 101.4, then 102.1, then 103.3. Cresswell watched the numbers climb with the kind of stillness that only comes when you've already imagined every version of this moment. Infection, the invisible enemy that haunts every single cut, every single stitch. He pushed antibiotics through the IV, broad spectrum, aggressive. When the fever kept rising, he doubled down. And then he did something he hadn't done since the surgery began. He sat down. For 18 hours, he didn't move from that bedside, watching, waiting. One hand on the boy's pulse, the other on his phone, the number for the nearest emergency room already pulled up. The threshold was 104 degrees. If that number appeared on the screen, he would have to make an impossible choice: expose everything he'd done or risk losing the boy entirely. The fever broke on day 4. Cresswell allowed himself 2 hours of sleep. 2 hours. And when he woke, something in the back of his mind whispered that it wasn't over. He was right. Day 7. The temperature spiked again, and this time it didn't creep. It slammed upward. 104.2 degrees in less than 3 hours. Cresswell pulled back the bandage and saw what he had been afraid of since the moment he first picked up the scalpel. The incision was angry, swollen, a deep spreading red that moved through the tissue like fire through dry wood. He recognized it immediately, the early, unmistakable signs of necrotizing fasciitis, an infection that doesn't just wound, it consumes. The tissue underneath, the grafts, the months of careful reconstruction, all of it would be eaten alive, and if it spread far enough, it would take the boy with it. Within 48 hours, that's how long they had. There was only one option. He had to open the boy back up, cut away everything the infection had claimed, a procedure that meant operating on a child with a fever high enough to trigger seizures, without a hospital, without a crash team, without anyone in the world who even knew this was happening. Cresswell scrubbed in again, and he began. The moment he opened the sight, the smell hit him like a wall. Sweet, putrid, the kind of scent that settles in the back of your throat and stays there long after you've left the room. It was the smell of the body turning against itself, tissue that had surrendered, gone soft and dark and wrong. Cresswell didn't gag. He didn't pause. He simply began removing it, layer by layer. Everything the infection had claimed, he cut away. Then he flooded the wound with antiseptic, clean, ruthless, surgical, and packed what was left with gauze soaked in antibiotics. A fortress built from sterile cloth and desperate precision. What followed was not a single dramatic moment. It was 72 hours of something far harder. Quiet. Every 6 hours, Cresswell changed the packing. Every 6 hours, he peeled back the dressing and really looked to see whether the red was spreading or the pink was returning. Spreading meant failure. Pink meant the boy's body was still fighting, still trying. And so he watched and waited and changed the gauze and watched again. On the 4th day, the fever dropped, and this time, for the first time, it stayed down. The tissue began to do what tissue does when it's finally allowed to. It knit itself back together, granulated, built new ground where the infection had burned the old. Cresswell closed the incision for the second time, his hands steadier now than they had been the first, not because he was less afraid, because he had already lived through the worst version of this and survived it. He knew exactly how close he had come. That night, he opened his journal and wrote. Not with emotion, not with relief, with precision. Systemic infection, nearly catastrophic. The boy survived through luck as much as anything I did. He paused, tapped the pen against the page. then added one more line. Future procedures will require far more aggressive antibiotic protocols from the start. He closed the book, set down the pen, and moved on to the next problem. Because there was always a next problem. The tattoos. They covered parts of the boy's skin like a language written in cruelty, marks that told anyone who looked exactly what had been done to him and by whom. Cresswell couldn't simply cut them out. The scarring would have been worse than the tattoos themselves. Too wide, too obvious, too permanent in its own way. So he chose a slower path. Dermabrasion, a process that stripped the marked skin away in thin, careful sheets, not all at once but layer by layer like peeling back time itself. And in its place he grafted new skin, harvested from the boy's own thighs, from his own buttocks, tissue taken from places no one would see, transplanted to places everyone would. It took weeks. The grafts were fragile things, raw and newborn, clinging to their new home with the faintest thread of biology. They needed constant attention, dressing changes that felt endless, vigilance that blurred one day into the next. Cresswell studied surgical texts each night by lamplight, cross-referencing techniques, studying photographs of grafts that had taken and grafts that hadn't, memorizing the difference between success and failure at the cellular level. 2 of the grafts failed in the second week. The tissue went dark, necrotized, died quietly despite everything Cresswell had done to keep it alive. He removed the dead skin without ceremony, cleaned the sites, and grafted again. But here was the thing that surprised him, the thing he hadn't quite expected. Even after all these weeks of watching this boy's body absorb punishment after punishment, it healed. Not slowly, not reluctantly. The boy's body, young underneath all the damage, stronger than the malnutrition had suggested, reached for recovery like a drowning man reaches for air. It was resilient in a way that bordered on the remarkable, as if something underneath all that skin still remembered what it was supposed to be. Cresswell noted it, filed it away, and kept going. And then came the piano. The room was different from everywhere else in that house. Quieter, warmer, the kind of space where the air itself felt held, cupped in the hands of someone who had once cared deeply about what happened inside it. The Steinway sat in the center, still maintained, still polished, still waiting the way instruments wait, patient and indifferent to who sits before them. The boy was brought in and seated on the bench. His wrists were restrained but loosely now. His hands were free. Cresswell placed the sheet music on the stand and stepped back. Chopin, the nocturnes that Sebastian had played by age 14, as if he'd been born with them already in his fingers. The boy stared at the page, not with recognition, not with anything close to understanding. He looked at those notes the way someone looks at a map written in a language they've never encountered, shapes that meant nothing. His fingers found the keys and pressed down with the graceless, heavy weight of someone who had never once felt ivory beneath them. No flow, no memory, no ghost of melody living in the tendons of his hands. Something cold settled in Cresswell's chest. Not anger, not frustration, something quieter than that. Something that looked, if you weren't careful, a little like grief. But he pushed it down, because he had seen this before, not with this boy, with another, with Sebastian himself years and years ago, when the boy had sat on this very bench and refused to play anything but jazz. Stubborn, defiant, convinced that the music Cresswell wanted him to learn was not meant for him. Sebastian had been wrong. Resistance, Cresswell understood, was not the end of a thing. It was the beginning. He started from the very foundation. Middle C, a single note pressed and held. Then the C major scale, 8 notes in a row, the simplest architecture music has to offer. The boy's fingers cramped after 10 minutes. The joints ached. The muscles, unused to this kind of precise, sustained demand, began to seize and rebel. Cresswell told him to keep going. An hour passed, then 2, then 3. And somewhere in that third hour, beneath the cramping and the confusion and the quiet grinding resistance, blisters began to form on the boy's fingertips. Raw, red, painful. Cresswell watched them appear. And he did not stop. The blisters split open on the second day. Cresswell wrapped the fingertips in gauze, clean, tight, precise, and guided the boy's hands back to the keys. The boy flinched. Every press now carried a small, bright flare of pain that shot up through the knuckles and into the wrist. But the gauze muffled it just enough. And Cresswell's voice, steady, unhurried, leaving no room for negotiation, carried it the rest of the way. Again. On the fourth day, something happened that neither of them expected. The boy had been moving through the C major scale with mechanical faithfulness, note after note, landing exactly where he'd been taught to land, lifting exactly when he'd been told to lift. A metronome made of flesh. And then, without warning, without any visible shift in his posture or his breathing or the set of his jaw, his hand moved somewhere it had never been told to go. A chord. Not from the exercise, not from anywhere on the page. A dense, ugly cluster of notes that clashed against each other like broken glass. Dissonant, deliberate. The musical equivalent of a fist slammed against a wall. The sound filled the room and hung there, 3 full seconds of something raw and uncontrolled and alive, before the boy's fingers quietly returned to their proper position on the keys. The room went still. Cresswell watched the boy's face. Nothing there. No flicker of defiance. No awareness that anything unusual had just occurred. And yet the sound had come from somewhere. Something inside that body had reached out through the only channel it had through 10 fingers and 88 keys and screamed. Cresswell wrote it down that evening. Not as what it was. He wrote it as what it needed to be. Unproductive neural resistance. Residual identity attempting expression through available motor channels. He paused over the page, pen hovering. Then added, recommendation, increase practice duration. He adjusted the metronome, faster now, and made the boy continue for 2 more hours. By the time it was over, the gauze on the boy's fingertips had bloomed red in the center, blood seeping through the white like watercolors bleeding into wet paper, and his eyes had changed. Something behind them had gone quiet in a way that Cresswell recognized. A glassy, faraway quality, the look of a mind that has retreated from a body that will not stop hurting it. Psychological fragmentation. Cresswell noted this too, and filed it under progress. The months that followed were, in purely technical terms, a success. The boy's fingers learned the geography of the keyboard the way a traveler learns a foreign city, not through understanding but through repetition, step by step, corner by corner, until the route becomes automatic and the body moves without the mind's permission, his timing steady. His dynamics, the softness and the force of each note, began to approximate what the sheet music asked for. The notes fell in the right order. The phrases arrived on time. But Cresswell understood, with a clarity that never wavered, exactly what he had built. A machine, not a musician. A mechanism that produced sounds in the correct sequence with the correct weight and the correct spacing. Technically flawless in the way a player piano is technically flawless, every note accounted for, every interval precise, every dynamic marking honored, and yet utterly, profoundly empty. There was no interpretation living in those fingers, no understanding of why a phrase moved the way it moved, or what the space between two notes was meant to evoke. No soul underneath the architecture. A real musician, someone who had spent their life inside the language of music, would hear it immediately, not in a wrong note or a missed beat, in the absence, the silence where feeling should be, the hollow center of something that looked from the outside exactly like art. But that was the genius of it, wasn't it? The people who would hear the boy play, the people who had known Sebastian primarily as a name at a dinner party, a face at a charity event, a social creature rather than an artist, they would never hear that absence. They would hear the notes. They would hear the tempo. They would hear something that sounded enough like the man they remembered to fill the space he had left behind. The illusion of recovery, wrapped in Chopin, delivered with bleeding hands. It would be enough. In the evenings, Cresswell ate alone. The dining room was large in the way that rooms are large when they were designed for a family that no longer exists. Too much space, too much silence, too many chairs pushed in against a table that could seat 12. He sat at the head of it, the way Sebastian had sat, and ate from Sebastian's china, drank from Sebastian's crystal. The kind of porcelain and glass that had been chosen by someone who understood that the weight of a fork, the ring of a glass, could say something about who you were before you ever opened your mouth. Above him on the walls, the portraits watched. Generation after generation of the same face, rendered in oil and gold leaf, the same jawline, the same guarded eyes, the same expression that managed to convey, across centuries of paint and canvas, a single unspoken thought. You have not met the standard. They had looked at Sebastian that way. They had looked at his father that way. And now they looked at Cresswell, the only living person in this house, with the same quiet, unyielding weight of expectation. He had told no one about the boy. There was no one left to tell. His colleagues had drifted away in the way that people drift from someone who has stopped being useful to them. Not suddenly, not with any dramatic severance, but quietly, one unreturned phone call at a time, until the silence between them became the relationship itself. His wife had left the year after Sebastian died, not with anger, not even with sadness really, with the simple, exhausted recognition that she had married a man who had already belonged entirely to something else, and that something else was gone now, and there was nothing underneath it. His social circle had found other surgeons to admire, other brilliance to orbit. And so Cresswell sat alone, in a dead man's chair, eating from a dead man's plates, watched over by the painted ghosts of a bloodline that had never once been satisfied. Somewhere above him the boy slept, fed through a tube, silent. And the house held its breath. The loneliness arrived the way winter arrives, not all at once, but in degrees so small you don't feel the cold until you realize you can no longer remember what warmth felt like. Cresswell had not chosen isolation. He had simply stopped having a reason to leave it. And the truth was he needed it. What was happening inside that house required the kind of silence that the outside world could never provide. No visitors, no questions, no eyes that might look at the boy and see something that didn't belong. The work demanded a sealed world, a controlled environment, every variable accounted for, every thread of connection to the life the boy had lived before severed, quietly, one by one, until there was nothing left to pull him back. The boy could not remember who he had been. That was the point. That was the architecture of the whole thing. And for that to work, there could be no anchors, no mirrors, no voices from before. Not yet. By December, the The face had become something else entirely. Not a copy, not yet, but close enough that anyone passing the boy in a hallway, anyone who had once shaken Sebastian's hand at a reception or admired him from across a room, would feel something stir, a recognition they couldn't quite place. The jaw had been narrowed with the kind of precision that left no visible trace of intervention. The chin refined. The cheekbones lifted subtly, almost imperceptibly, with implants placed so carefully that the face didn't look altered so much as it looked inevitable, as though it had always been meant to land exactly here. The nose was healing well. The skin grafts had held. The tattoos were gone, erased so thoroughly that even Cresswell, who had done the erasing, sometimes forgot they had ever been there. But the eyes were wrong. Cresswell studied them during examinations the way a painter studies a canvas that refuses to resolve, searching for the specific quality that kept the whole thing from clicking into place. The color was close. Both had that shifting, indeterminate hazel green in one light, brown in another, the kind of eyes that changed with the weather. But something in the expression wouldn't cooperate. Something deeper than pigment, deeper than structure. Sebastian's eyes had been confident, assured. The eyes of someone who had grown up believing the world was built to accommodate him. They held no apology, no uncertainty. They simply looked. The boy's eyes did something different. They watched. They waited. They carried in them a quiet, ancient expectation, not of comfort, but of harm. The kind of wariness that doesn't come from a single bad moment, but from a lifetime of moments, stacked one on top of another, until the body learns to brace before the blow even arrives. These eyes expected to be betrayed, and no amount of surgery could fix that. The problem, Cresswell understood with a coldness that settled somewhere behind his sternum, was not in the bone. It was not in the skin. It lived somewhere beneath both, in the architecture of the mind itself, in whatever part of a person decides, before they are old enough to choose, what the world is going to do to them. This would require a different kind of intervention. He doubled the piano sessions, then tripled them. 6 hours a day now, the boy seated at the Steinway from morning until the light outside turned gray, his fingers moving through chopping with the steady, hollow faithfulness of someone performing an act of survival rather than music. The calluses came, hard ridges of skin built up across the fingertips like armor, like the body's own quiet protest against what was being asked of it. But the music stayed exactly where it had always been, empty, technically present, emotionally gone. Cresswell sat beside him on the bench and played. Not to perform, to demonstrate, to show the boy with his own hands, his own breath, his own sense of where a phrase should breathe and where it should ache, what the music was supposed to feel like when it lived inside someone. He played a passage slowly, then gestured for the boy to follow. The boy followed. The notes were correct. The shape was right. But the feeling, the weight, the intention, the invisible thing that turns a sequence of sounds into an act of expression was absent, copied without being understood. The way a child might repeat a word in a foreign language, perfectly pronounced, completely meaningless. And so Cresswell began to talk. He hadn't planned to. It simply started happening, the way water finds a crack in stone and begins, without announcement, to flow through it. He found himself describing Sebastian during the sessions, not in broad strokes, in specifics. The way Sebastian held his wrist when he played, slightly turned, as though he were offering something. The afternoon recital, years ago, when Sebastian had performed a single nocturne so completely, so wholly, that 3 people in the audience had quietly begun to cry without knowing why. The way Sebastian had understood instinctively that music was not about the notes. It was about the spaces between them. The boy listened, not with engagement, not with curiosity, with the blank, patient stillness of someone who has learned, through months of lessons that left him with bleeding fingers and glass eyes, that resistance only makes the thing last longer. He absorbed the words the way dry ground absorbs rain, silently, completely, giving nothing back. He never spoke. The gag had been removed weeks ago. Cresswell had simply taken it off one morning without ceremony and left the boy's mouth free. The boy had not tested the freedom, had not opened his mouth to say a single word, not in protest, not in pain, not in the small, involuntary ways that people make sound when they are suffering. It was as though he had understood without being told that speech was not part of what was allowed here, that the silence was not a cage but a rule, and that breaking it would cost him something he could not afford to lose. So the boy stayed quiet, and the house stayed quiet with him. Christmas morning, Cresswell brought him to the mirror. Not the small one above the bathroom sink. The full-length glass in the hallway, tall and old and framed in dark wood. The kind of mirror that had been in that house long before Sebastian was born, long before any of them were born. The kind that seemed to hold not just a reflection but a verdict. The boy stood before it in his restraints, wrists bound loosely at his sides, his body supported by Cresswell's hand against the small of his back. Upright, still, and for a long, suspended moment he simply stared. The face looking back at him was not the face he had been born with. It was not the face he had lived in for every year of his life up until the night he was taken. The swelling was gone. The bruising had faded to nothing. The skin was smooth and healed and new, grafted and shaped and sculpted into something that belonged to someone else's bloodline, someone else's history. It was, by any measure, a stranger's face. And the boy knew it. Something shifted behind those wary hazel eyes, something small and tectonic, like a fault line moving deep underground. His hand rose, slowly, the way a person reaches for something they aren't sure is real. His fingertips made contact with the glass first, then gently with his own cheek. He traced the line of his jaw, the bridge of his new nose, the unfamiliar ridge of his cheekbones. Each touch a question. Each touch an answer he wasn't equipped to understand. And then his lips moved. Silently, no sound. The muscles around his jaw were still knitting themselves back together, involuntary speech. The kind that requires coordination, intention, effort, was still beyond what his body could reliably produce. But the shape was there. The mouth formed itself around something. A word, maybe a name. The syllables moved across his lips like a ghost passing through a wall, visible for one flickering instant, then gone. It looked like Rooker. Cresswell watched it happen from 2 feet away, his hand still resting against the boy's back. He saw the mouth move. He saw the word form and dissolve. And something in him, something he had spent months building walls around, registered it, filed it, held it close to the light for just a moment before setting it carefully, deliberately back in the dark. A name, perhaps, or the ghost of one. The boy turned his face back to the mirror and kept looking. There was a satisfaction in it that Cresswell did not examine too closely. The boy could no longer say his own name. Not because the words had been taken from him in any obvious way, not cut out, not silenced by force, but because the name itself had been dismantled, piece by piece. The way you dismantle a house, not by demolishing it, but by removing everything that made it a home. The boy's name had belonged to a face that no longer existed, to a body that had been reshaped, reskinned, rebuilt from the inside out. And so the name, too, had become a ghost. A thing that lived in no mouth, belonged to no one. Cresswell noted this in his journal, with the quiet pleasure of a man watching an experiment confirm his hypothesis. But it was what happened in the mirror that stayed with him. Not the boy's stillness, not the careful, practiced neutrality he had learned to wear the way someone learns to wear a mask, automatically, instinctively, as protection. It was the moment, brief, almost invisible, when something behind those eyes cracked open. Not acceptance. Nothing so clean as that. Something rawer. A horrified, wordless understanding that the door behind him had closed. That whatever he had been before, whoever lived inside that body before Cresswell found him, was not coming back. That the transformation had moved past the point where anyone, including Cresswell, could undo it. The boy had seen his own face, and understood in one silent instant that it was no longer his. The escape attempt happened on a Tuesday. January had settled over the house like a held breath, cold, gray, still. The boy had been compliant for weeks, quietly, reliably compliant. He played when he was told to play. He ate when he was fed. He slept when the lights went off. Cresswell had grown comfortable with this, not careless exactly, but comfortable. The way you grow comfortable with a rhythm that is held for a long time without breaking. He should have known better. It was during a piano session. Cresswell had stepped into the kitchen not far, not for long, just long enough to pour water into a glass and set it on a tray. The music room was 30 seconds away. The boy was alone for less than a minute. When Cresswell returned, the room was empty. The bench had been knocked sideways, not violently, but deliberately, the way you move something out of your path when you are trying to be fast and quiet at the same time. The sheet music had slid off the stand and lay scattered across the floor like fallen leaves. The restraints, the leather straps that had held the boy's wrists to the bench for weeks, tightened through the same holes, adjusted to the same tension, hung open. Weakened by pressure, by time, by the slow, patient, invisible work of a body that had been pushing against them, millimeter by millimeter, for longer than Cresswell had thought to check. He set the tray down. His first response was not panic. It was not even urgency. It was disappointment, quiet, almost parental, the kind of feeling that surfaces when someone you have invested in does something predictable and foolish. He had expected more from the boy. He had expected the compliance to be deeper than this. He had expected, and here was the thing that would have unsettled him if he had let it, he had expected to be trusted. He set down the glass and listened. A house like this one speaks, if you know how to hear it. It is not in the creaks or the groans of old wood settling, though those are there too. It is in the changes, the way silence shifts when someone is moving through it, the way air pressure alters, almost imperceptibly, when a door opens in a room you cannot see, the way a draft moves differently when a body is interrupting its path. Cresswell knew this house the way a surgeon knows an operating table, every surface, every joint, every place where the structure reveals itself under pressure. He stood in the kitchen doorway and closed his eyes, and he listened. A creak, hallway, northeast corner. A shift in the air, subtle, like the house drawing a breath. Someone had passed through the space between the dining room and the front entrance. He followed it, not quickly, not with any urgency that might have betrayed what he was feeling. He simply walked, the way someone walks through their own home in the middle of a quiet afternoon, and let the sounds lead him. He found the boy in the front hall. The main door was old and heavy, and locked with a mechanism that no ordinary hand could open quickly. Cresswell had designed it himself, years ago, installed it himself, not because he had anticipated this moment, but because Sebastian had sleepwalked, had wandered in the small hours toward exits and edges and open air, drawn by something in his dreaming mind that the waking world could not satisfy. The lock had been built to hold against a confused teenager in the dark. It had not been built to hold against someone who desperately, consciously, needed to get through it. The boy's fingers were moving across the mechanism, fumbling, searching, pressing and turning and pressing again. His breathing was fast, shallow, the kind of breathing that comes not from exertion but from fear, the body flooding itself with oxygen because it senses that something very bad is about to happen and it wants to be ready. And beneath the breathing, beneath the frantic, stuttering movements of his hands against the lock's small sounds, whimpers, thin and involuntary like air escaping through a crack. The first sounds Cresswell had heard him make in weeks. The boy did not hear him approach. Cresswell moved quietly, not stealthily, but with the natural, unhurried silence of someone who had spent a lifetime learning to move through spaces without disturbing them. He was 3 steps away before the boy sensed something. A change in the air, a shift in the density of the room behind him. The boy turned, his back pressed flat against the door, the only solid thing in the world, the only barrier between himself and whatever was on the other side of it. His new face, the face Cresswell had built, had shaped, had grafted and healed and sculpted into something that belonged to another man's life, was contorted with an expression that no amount of surgery could have predicted or controlled. Fear, raw, unmediated, the kind of fear that lives beneath everything else, beneath training, beneath compliance, beneath months of learned silence. The kind that surfaces only when the body believes it is about to die. The boy opened his mouth. The sound that came out was not a word, not quite. The damage to his palate made true articulation difficult, the muscles still healing, the pathways between intention and sound still being rebuilt. But the shape of it was there. The meaning was unmistakable. The mouth formed itself around something that sounded, in its broken way, like a plea. Please. One syllable, barely voiced, more breath than sound. It was the first thing the boy had said in weeks. Cresswell reached into his pocket and drew out the syringe he had taken to carrying, not out of paranoia, out of preparedness. The way a doctor carries a pen, not because he expects to need it every moment, but because the moment it is needed, there is no time to go looking for one. He closed the distance between them in 2 steps. The boy flinched, tried to move, but his back was against the door and there was nowhere left to go, and Cresswell's hand was already on his arm, firm, practiced, the grip of someone who has done this before and knows exactly how much pressure is required and exactly where to apply it. The needle found the vein with the ease of long habit. The boy's eyes stayed open for 3 seconds after the injection. 3 seconds in which something behind them, something that had been fighting, quietly, persistently, for months flickered and went dark. His body went slack. Cresswell caught him before he hit the floor, one arm beneath the shoulders, the other hooked under the knees, lifting with the practiced efficiency of someone who has carried unconscious bodies before and knows that the hardest part is not the weight, but the way it distributes itself, dead and uncooperative, against your arms. He checked the pulse, elevated but not dangerously. The boy was alive. The boy was simply gone temporarily, chemically, quietly absent from his own body. Cresswell carried him back upstairs. The bedroom had been prepared. New restraints. Not leather this time, something harder, something that could not be weakened by pressure or time or the slow, patient work of fingers pushing against the same point for weeks. The boy was laid down, secured, and Cresswell stood over him for a long moment, looking at the face he had made, and made a decision. The punishment would not be pain. Pain, Cresswell understood, was crude. It taught a body to flinch, but it did not teach a mind to stop wanting. The boy had tried to leave. The desire to leave was still there, buried beneath the sedation, beneath the compliance, beneath everything Cresswell had built on top of it. And desire, unlike pain, could not be beaten out of someone. It could only be made irrelevant. So instead of punishing the boy, Cresswell accelerated the work. The next morning, the zygomatic implants went in. Both cheeks, opened and rebuilt before the incisions from the previous round of work had fully closed, the tissue still pink and tender and vulnerable, the healing not yet complete. It was aggressive. It was, by any standard, reckless. But it was also deliberate. Every day that passed was a day the boy's mind had to sit inside a body that still felt, in some deep and unspoken way, like its own. Every procedure stripped that feeling away a little further. Every scar, every implant, every alteration made the body less recognizable as something the boy had ever inhabited. The dermabrasion on the back came next, extended now wider than it needed to be. The last visible tattoo was removed, yes, but Cresswell took the surrounding tissue with it. Healthy skin, unmarked skin, skin that had carried no message and bore no mark and had simply been there, undisturbed, for years. He removed it anyway, because the tattoo had lived among it, because the body needed to forget that anything had ever been written on it at all. And then, in the quiet hours between procedures, Cresswell turned on the music. Not the exercises, not the scales, not the mechanical, soulless reproductions the boy had been producing at the Steinway for months. Sebastian's voice. Not his speaking voice, his playing voice. Recordings from the years before he disappeared from the world. Performances captured in rooms much like this one, warm, resonant, alive with the kind of presence that fills a space and refuses to leave it. The nocturnes, played by the hands that had first learned them on this very piano. The preludes, rendered with the effortless depth that had once made strangers weep without understanding why. Cresswell set them playing on a loop and left them running. The music filled the bedroom the way light fills a room with no curtains, completely, indifferently, touching everything. It played while the boy slept. It played while the sedation wore off and the boy's eyes opened, slow and confused, to a ceiling he had stared at for months. It played while the new incisions throbbed and the skin on his back burned with the raw, exposed sting of freshly removed tissue. It played and played and played. And somewhere in the house, Cresswell sat alone and listened to his dead son's hands move across the keys and waited for the boy to become him. The music did not stop. Not for 18 hours. Not for anything. It poured through the bedroom like water through an open vein, Sebastian's fingers moving across the keys in recordings made years and miles and lifetimes away from this room, but played here now again and again, with a patience that had no bottom. The nocturnes bled into the preludes. The preludes dissolved into the intermezzos. And then it all began again, from the top, exactly as it had before, looping back on itself like a river that has forgotten where the sea is. The boy had no choice but to listen. He could not leave. He could not cover his ears. He could not sleep through it, not reliably, not for long. The music found the edges of unconsciousness and slipped through them, threading itself into the boy's dreams the way a vine threads itself through a fence, slowly, invisibly, until one day you realize it has become part of the structure. Cresswell watched what happened next with the careful attention of someone observing a chemical reaction he has set in motion but cannot fully predict. The boy's sleep began to fragment. Not disappear, fragment. Breaking into thin, shallow stretches interrupted by long, glassy hours of wakefulness in which the boy lay perfectly still and stared at the ceiling with eyes that were open but not quite present. A dissociation so complete it looked, from the outside, like a kind of peace. But it wasn't peace. It was the mind doing what minds do when they are being asked to hold two versions of themselves at the same time, shutting down the parts that can't reconcile the contradiction, going quiet in the places where the noise has become unbearable. And then, during the piano sessions, something began to happen that made Cresswell set down his pen and simply watch. The boy's fingers moved on their own. Not the mechanical, obedient movements of the exercises, not the careful, learned sequences he had been drilling for months. Something else. Something that came from underneath the training, from the place where the music had been playing over and over, while the boy slept and woke and slept again. His hands would drift off the page. The sheet music would say one thing, and his fingers would do another, reaching for a melody that wasn't written there, that existed only in the recordings, only in Sebastian's voice, only in the sound that had been filling the room for weeks without pause or permission. The boy was beginning to absorb it. Not understand it, not yet, but absorb it the way a sponge absorbs water passively, completely, without any choice in the matter. The old patterns were dissolving. The new ones were writing themselves into the muscle, into the nerve, into the deepest architecture of the hands. Cresswell watched this happen and felt something he recognized, after a moment, as hope. By February, the body was almost finished. Almost. The face in the mirror had become, by any measure, Sebastian's face. Not a suggestion of it, not an approximation. The jaw, the chin, the cheekbones, the nose, all of it landed now in exactly the place Sebastian's features had occupied. The skin had healed cleanly. The grafts had taken. The implants had settled into the bone as though they had always lived there. A stranger looking at the boy would not see a reconstruction. They would see a man, a specific man. A man with a name and a history, and a bloodline that stretched back through generations of portraits in a hallway neither of them would ever walk again. The hands had changed too. Months of forced practice, hours of pressing and stretching and moving against resistance, had done what hands do when you demand enough of them. They had lengthened, strengthened. The fingers had grown elegant in the way that fingers grow elegant when they have spent enough time on piano keys, not by accident, but by the slow, relentless pressure of repetition. They looked now like hands that had always belonged to music, like hands that had been born for it. The posture had been corrected through a combination of exercises that bordered on torture, and the quiet, unspoken understanding that noncompliance would not be tolerated. The boy sat differently now, held himself differently, moved through space with a straightness that Sebastian had carried like a second skin, unconscious, inherited, the physical grammar of a life spent in rooms where how you held your body said as much as anything you could say with your mouth. But the voice was wrong. It had been wrong from the beginning, and Cresswell had known it, and had set it aside, filed it under later, under after the face, after the hands, after everything else. Because the voice was the hardest thing. The voice was the thing that lived deepest inside a person, not in the throat, not in the tongue, not in any structure that could be opened and reshaped with a scalpel. It lived in the way someone had grown up speaking, in the rhythms they had learned as a child, in a place, among people, who sounded a certain way. It lived in the accent, that stubborn, regional, deeply human quality that no amount of elocution training could fully erase. Cresswell had tried. He had installed recordings of Sebastian's voice in the bedroom alongside the music. Sebastian speaking, not performing, not reciting, but simply talking. Casual conversations captured on tape years ago. The way Sebastian said good morning, the way he ordered wine, the way he laughed. The boy had listened to all of it with the same blank, patient compliance he brought to everything. And when he opened his mouth to speak on the rare occasions Cresswell permitted him to, the sounds that emerged were wrong. Close. Closer than they had been. But wrong in a way that Cresswell could hear immediately. The way a musician hears a single note out of tune in an otherwise perfect chord. The accent clung to the boy's speech like something alive, something that refused to be replaced. It was unacceptable. Cresswell could not present a son who sounded like he came from somewhere else, somewhere low, somewhere that Sebastian would never have acknowledged. The voice had to change, and if training could not change it, if repetition and recordings and hours of practice could not reach the place where the accent lived, then something else would have to. He made the decision on a Wednesday. The surgery was called lingual manipulation. It was, by any honest assessment, one of the most dangerous procedures Cresswell had ever considered, not because it was complicated, though it was, but because the margin for error was so thin that it barely existed. The vocal cords lived in a space so narrow, so delicate, that a single millimeter of imprecision could compromise the airway permanently, could silence the boy forever, not by choice but by damage, could turn a voice into nothing at all. Cresswell spent 3 days reviewing the technique, reading, rereading, studying diagrams and surgical reports and case studies of procedures that had gone right and procedures that had gone catastrophically wrong. He needed endoscopic visualization, a camera threaded down into the throat to show him exactly what he was doing in real time. He needed micro-manipulation tools. He needed the kind of steady, unhurried precision that only comes when you have performed a task so many times that your hands know the way without being told. And he needed the boy to wake up. Not fully, not completely, but partway enough to test the results mid-procedure, enough to swallow, to vocalize, to demonstrate that the airway was still open and the cords were still functioning. A partial awakening, carefully timed, carefully dosed. The boy would surface just long enough to prove he was still alive in the ways that mattered, and then Cresswell would put him back under. It was, in every sense, a dance performed on the edge of a cliff. He opened the windows before he began. January air poured into the operating room, sharp, biting, cold enough to sting the skin and tighten the muscles in his forearms. He opened them deliberately. Not because the room needed ventilation, because the cold kept him sharp, because warmth in a room where everything depended on precision was a kind of danger. Because Sebastian, years ago, had told him once that the best performances happened in cold rooms, that the body, when it was slightly uncomfortable, paid closer attention to itself. Cresswell had not thought about Sebastian when he opened the windows. He told himself he hadn't. The incision was clean, precise. The endoscope moved into place with the smooth, practiced ease of a tool being guided by hands that had done this 1,000 times in 1,000 other contexts. And then the bleeding began. More than expected, more than the textbook suggested, more than Cresswell had planned for. The tissue opened and the blood came, and it did not slow the way blood is supposed to slow when the body is cooperating. And for 6 minutes, 6 minutes that stretched themselves into something that felt like an hour, Cresswell thought the boy might die on this table. His hands did not shake. They moved with automatic precision, clamping, cauterizing, sealing, while something else, something quieter and colder, ran calculations in the back of his mind. Blood loss, rate of hemorrhage, time before the numbers became unsurvivable, the distance to the nearest emergency room, the story he would need to construct if he got there, a failed suicide attempt perhaps, a boy found too late, a wound that no one could explain except as the desperate act of someone who had already decided to leave. But the bleeding slowed. Not quickly, not cleanly, but it slowed. The vessels sealed, the hemorrhage retreated, and the boy's vitals, a fragile flickering held together by the thinnest thread of chemistry and luck, steadied, stabilized, held. Cresswell exhaled, once slowly, and kept going. The partial awakening was the moment everything balanced on a knife's edge. He reduced the anesthetic drip by careful, measured degrees, not all at once, but in increments so small they were almost imperceptible. The boy's body began to surface the way a diver surfaces from deep water, slowly, reluctantly, the consciousness rising through layers of chemical fog that did not want to release him. His eyelids fluttered, his fingers twitched against the table, and then his eyes opened, not all the way, but enough, glassy, unfocused, present in the loosest possible sense of the word. Cresswell leaned into his line of sight, close enough that the boy could see his face, even through the haze, and spoke to him, quietly, clearly, with the calm authority of someone giving an instruction that must be followed exactly as given, or everything falls apart. He told the boy to swallow. The boy opened his mouth, and for a long suspended moment, nothing came out. Not silence exactly, something thinner than silence. A breath pushed through a throat that had been cut open and rebuilt and was now in this half-waking, half-chemical state, being asked to do the one thing it had not yet proven it could do again. Produce sound. Shape air into something that meant something. Be a voice. Cresswell watched. His fingers rested against the boy's throat, not gripping, but feeling. Sensing the movement of the cords beneath the skin the way a mechanic feels an engine vibrate, reading the information through his fingertips. He had asked for a vowel, just a vowel. The simplest, most primitive unit of human sound, open mouth, breath moving, nothing else required. The boy gave it to him. A low, rough exhalation that carried just enough vibration to qualify. It was barely a sound. It was everything. Cresswell made his adjustments, quickly, precisely. The modifications he had planned, the fine-tuning that could only be done while the tissue was still responsive, and the boy was still conscious enough to produce sound, but not conscious enough to resist. His hands moved with the economy of someone who knows exactly how much time he has, and will not waste a single second of it. Then the anesthetic went back in, and the boy disappeared again. 3 weeks of silence. Not chosen silence, not the quiet, patient silence the boy had practiced for months in this house, the kind that was its own form of survival. This was medical silence, enforced, absolute. The vocal cords needed to heal without being disturbed, and any sound, any vibration, any attempt to speak or cry or even hum could undo everything Cresswell had done in that operating room. So the boy lay in his bed, awake for hours at a time, and said nothing, could say nothing. The silence was not a choice. It was a condition of staying alive. Cresswell used the time. The hair went first. Cut by Cresswell's own hands, not by a barber, not by anyone who might ask questions or remember a face. He studied photographs of Sebastian from the years before, the way it fell across the forehead, the length at the back, the particular angle at which it sat against the jaw. He cut the boy's hair to match, strand by strand, with the same meticulous attention he brought to everything else. When it was done, he stood back and looked, and something in the proportions of the face shifted, settled the way a picture settles when you finally hang it at the right height on the wall. The nails, trimmed and shaped, filed to the same length Sebastian had kept them, not short, not long, but precisely, deliberately maintained. The kind of detail that no one notices consciously but that everyone registers, somewhere beneath awareness, as a signal. A signal that says, this person takes care of himself. This person matters to himself. And then the teeth. 2 extractions. Orthodontic work that took the better part of a week. Quiet, careful adjustments that moved the remaining teeth into positions Sebastian's had occupied. Cresswell worked in the boy's mouth with the same steady hands he brought to everything, and the boy lay still beneath him, eyes open, staring at the ceiling, saying nothing because he could not say nothing, and the silence between them was the loudest thing in the house. When the 3 weeks were over, Cresswell gave him permission to speak. The boy opened his mouth, and the voice that came out was not Sebastian's, not exactly. Not in the way that a recording of Sebastian would sound exactly like Sebastian, but close, closer than Cresswell had dared to hope. The pitch sat in the right register, that particular, slightly lower tenor that Sebastian had possessed naturally, the kind of voice that filled a room without ever needing to raise itself. The timbre was nearly there, nearly. A shade different in the way that 2 shades of the same color are different. Noticeable only if you held them side by side, and even then, only if you were looking for the difference. Cresswell felt something unlock in his chest. A tightness he hadn't known was there, releasing, like a fist he'd been making for months, finally, quietly opening. He tested it. He brought the boy books, not random books, Sebastian's books. The ones Sebastian had read with the kind of attention that suggested they had changed something in him. The ones whose spines were cracked and whose margins were filled with notes in Sebastian's handwriting. He set them open on the table in front of the boy and said, "Read." The boy read. And here was the thing that surprised Cresswell. The thing that made him set down his pen and simply listen, without writing, without analyzing, without doing anything at all except letting the moment land where it landed. The boy read with mechanical precision, every syllable correctly shaped, every pause correctly placed. The rhythm of the sentences reproduced faithfully, note for note, the way a musician reproduces a score. But the meaning, the weight behind the words, the emotional intelligence that Sebastian had brought to every line, the interpretive instinct that had made Sebastian's readings feel less like recitation and more like discovery, that was absent. Entirely, completely absent. The boy was not reading. He was performing the physical act of reading. The sounds were right. The music was right. But no one was home behind them. And Cresswell, sitting across the table, realized with a clarity that felt almost like relief that this was actually better. Sebastian had been an interpreter. Sebastian had taken the words on the page and added to them his own emotion, his own understanding, his own irreducible selfhood layered on top of what the author had written. It made for beautiful readings. It also made for unpredictable ones. This version, this clean, faithful, soulless reproduction was something else entirely, something more useful, something that could be shaped, guided, directed, a voice without opinions of its own. A mouth that would say exactly what it was told to say, in exactly the way it was told to say it, and add nothing. More malleable, that was the word Cresswell used later in his journal. More malleable. Early March arrived with a coldness that had begun, finally, to soften at its edges, and Cresswell made his assessment. The transformation was complete. Not perfect, not in the way that the word perfect implies no visible scene, no place where the construction shows. There were still moments, small ones, easy to miss, when the boy's face did something Sebastian's face would never have done. a flicker of something too raw, too unguarded, too present to belong to the man Sebastian had been. But these moments were rare, and they were getting rarer. And for the purposes of what came next, for the purposes of the world outside this house, the world that had mourned Sebastian and moved on and would now have to be convinced to accept his return, they would not matter. Cresswell brought the boy to the dining room. The formal one. The one with the long table and the portraits and the china that had been Sebastian's and the crystal that caught the light from the windows and scattered it into small, quiet rainbows on the white tablecloth. He sat the boy down in Sebastian's chair, the one at the head of the table, the one that looked down the length of the room the way a throne looks down the length of a hall, and set a plate in front of him. The boy picked up his fork. Correctly, without hesitation, without being reminded or shown or guided. The grip was right. The angle was right. The small, precise movements that carried food from plate to mouth were right, not learned, not practiced, but automatic, as though the body had absorbed the grammar of this table the way it had absorbed the grammar of the piano keys. He cut his meat with a technique that Cresswell recognized immediately as the technique Sebastian had used, that particular way of holding the knife, blade angled just so. The cut made in one clean motion rather than a sawing back and forth. He placed his napkin in his lap before Cresswell had sat down. The boy ate in silence, eyes on his plate, posture straight, face composed into an expression of quiet, attentive calm that could have been contentment or could have been something else entirely, something deeper and darker and less nameable. And from the outside, from across a dinner table, there was no way to tell the difference. The silence pressed against the walls of the room, and Cresswell found himself filling it. He talked, not about anything important, not about the boy or the work or what was coming next. He talked about this room, about the dinner parties that had once filled it, the laughter, the clinking of glasses, the way Sebastian had commanded the table without ever raising his voice, simply by being the most interesting person in it. He talked about the guests who had praised Sebastian's playing after dessert, who had leaned across the table with genuine awe in their faces, and said things like, "I had no idea your son was that talented." He talked about the scholarships that had arrived during Sebastian's final year, 3 of them, each one more prestigious than the last, each one a confirmation that the world had noticed Sebastian and was willing to pay for the privilege of knowing him better. The boy listened, ate, said nothing, and the room held the ghost of every conversation that had ever happened inside it, and the silence between them was thick with all the things neither of them would ever say. Cresswell had planned to move slowly. He had planned to ease the boy back into the world the way you ease someone back into water after a long illness, inch by inch, temperature by temperature, giving the body time to adjust and the mind time to prepare. Weeks of practice, months maybe, a gradual reintroduction, carefully managed, carefully controlled. But the world, as it does, refused to wait. The property taxes had not been paid in 2 years. The town, the same town that had once hosted Sebastian's benefit concerts, that had watched Sebastian grow up with a kind of collective pride, was now threatening foreclosure. The house, with its portraits and its Steinway and its history, was going to be taken if money did not appear, and soon. Cresswell's savings, what was left of them, after months of surgical supplies and medications, and the 1,000 small, expensive necessities of rebuilding a human being from the ground up, were nearly gone. A number so small it barely qualified as a number anymore. He needed money. He needed the world to see him again. He needed to walk back into the life he had abandoned and present it with something it would accept. He needed a son. The story had been constructed over months, not written down, not recorded anywhere, but built in Cresswell's mind with the same meticulous attention he brought to everything else. A narrative, a sequence of events that could be believed if not questioned too closely, if offered at the right moment in the right tone to the right people. Sebastian had not died in the sailing accident. That was the foundation, the single fact upon which everything else was built. The accident, the one that had made the news, the one that had generated the obituary and the funeral and the grief that had hollowed out this house and left Cresswell alone inside it, had been a mistake, a case of mistaken identity. The body recovered from the water had not been Sebastian's, it had been someone else's. Someone who looked enough like Sebastian, in the wreckage and the chaos of that day, that no one had thought to look more closely. Sebastian had been alive the entire time, living abroad, quietly, alone, struggling with mental health issues that had kept him hidden, that had made him disappear deliberately from the life he had known because the weight of that life had become too heavy to carry. But now he had found his way back, rehabilitated, recovered, ready at last to come home. The story was implausible. Cresswell knew this. Anyone who thought about it too carefully, who pressed too hard on the details, would find the seams, would find the places where the narrative didn't quite hold together, where the timeline bent in ways that timelines shouldn't bend. But it was not impossible. And in Cresswell's experience, not impossible was usually enough. The socialization began in late March. He took the boy in the car, not into town, not yet, not anywhere near other people, just driving, moving through the landscape that Sebastian had grown up in, that Sebastian had known the way you know the streets of a city you were born in, not by studying them, but by breathing them in day after day, year after year, until they become part of the architecture of yourself. Cresswell drove slowly, and he talked. He pointed to a bend in the road where Sebastian had learned to ride a bicycle, a story that may or may not have been true, but that existed now, in the telling of it, as something real. He described the pond at the edge of the property where Sebastian had spent afternoons as a teenager, sitting on the bank with a book, reading in the kind of silence that teenagers read in when they are trying to figure out who they are going to become. He named the shops in the town center, the families who lived on each street, the small, specific, irreplaceable details that make up the geography of a life, the things that, if you had actually lived that life, you would know without being told. The boy absorbed all of it, not with interest, not with curiosity or recognition or any of the things a person might feel when they are being shown the landscape of their own history. He absorbed it the way a recording device absorbs sound, passively, completely, without judgment or response. The information entered him and settled somewhere deep, and nothing on the outside changed. Cresswell kept talking. He narrated continuously, filling every silence, every pause, every stretch of empty road with more information, more detail, more of the comprehensive false memory he was building, layer by layer inside the boy's mind. A life, an entire life constructed from the outside in, not lived, installed. And the car moved through the landscape of Sebastian's childhood, carrying two people who had not existed, not really, not in any way that mattered, until the moment Cresswell decided they did. The boy would need to know things, not just names and places and the geography of a life he had never lived. He would need to know the texture of it, the small, unremarkable details that people reach for when they are nervous, when they are being watched, when someone across a table asks a question, and the answer has to come back fast enough to feel natural. The way Sebastian took his coffee, the name of the first girl he kissed, the sound of the screen door at the back of the house on a summer afternoon. The thousand invisible threads that hold a person together in the minds of everyone who knows them. Cresswell fed him all of it. Night after night, in the weeks leading up to what was coming, he sat beside the boy and narrated. Not dramatically, not with any particular emotion. He simply spoke, the way someone might read aloud from a book, steady and unhurried, and the boy listened, and the information settled into him like sediment settling into still water. And by morning it was there, waiting, accessible, ready to be pulled to the surface when the moment required it. A life fully constructed, fully furnished, ready to be inhabited. Mid-April arrived with the tentative, uncertain warmth of a season that hasn't yet decided whether it's truly arrived. The event was the spring fundraiser for the local historical society, a gathering Cresswell knew well. He had attended these things for years, in another life, as Sebastian's father, as the proud, slightly distant man who stood near the back of the room with a glass of something expensive and watched his son move through the crowd with an ease that Cresswell himself had never possessed. It was the kind of event where people noticed things, where appearances mattered, where the gap between who you were and who you were seen to be could be closed, permanently, in a single evening. It was the perfect place to begin. He went to Sebastian's closet that morning and opened it slowly, the way you open something that has been sealed for a long time, aware that the air inside has been undisturbed, that the moment you break the seal, something changes that cannot be changed back. The clothes hung in silence, untouched. Sebastian's dinner jacket hung at the end of the row, dark and well cut, and when Cresswell reached for it, the smell hit him before his fingers closed around the fabric. Cedar, faint, preserved by the small blocks tucked into the corners of the closet months, maybe years, before Sebastian wore any of these clothes for the last time. The smell of care, of someone who maintained things, of a life that had been, in its way, tended. He carried the jacket to the boy's room and laid it on the bed. The boy dressed himself. No help, no guidance. No small corrections, the pocket square goes here, the cufflinks go through this way. He simply stood before the clothes and put them on piece by piece, with the quiet, automatic competence of someone performing a task they have done 1,000 times. The jacket settled across his shoulders as though it had been made for them. The shirt buttoned itself into place. The tie, dark, simple, knotted with a precision that Cresswell had not taught him, sat exactly where it should. When it was done, the boy turned to the mirror. And Cresswell, standing in the doorway, saw something that made the breath catch somewhere in his chest, without quite reaching his lungs. The resemblance was extraordinary. Not approximate, not suggestive, exact. The angle of the jaw, the set of the eyes still carrying that faint, unwanted weariness, but less now, softer, buried deeper beneath layers of composure and practice, and the slow, grinding work of becoming someone else. The way the hair fell across the forehead, the same way, at the same angle, with the same casual, almost accidental elegance that Sebastian had carried like a second gravity. The hands, adjusting the jacket at the wrist, long-fingered and precise. Cresswell looked at the boy in the mirror and saw his son. And for one brief, disorienting instant, he could not remember which one was which. The morning they were supposed to leave, the bedroom was empty. Cresswell noticed it the way you notice a sound that isn't there by the absence of it. The silence in the room was different from the silence it usually carried. Heavier, emptier. He crossed the threshold and the feeling sharpened into something specific, something with edges, The boy was not here, had not been here for some time. The window was open, not ajar, not cracked, forced, pushed outward from the inside with enough pressure to break the latch that had held it shut for months. The morning air moved through it freely now, carrying the smell of wet earth and new growth and the particular, clean coldness of an April dawn that has not yet been touched by the day's warmth. Cresswell walked to it and looked out. The trellis, old wood climbing the side of the house, sturdy enough to hold a man's weight if he moved quickly and didn't pause to test it. The boy had climbed down it, into the morning, into the world, into the first open air he had breathed in months. Cresswell stood at the window for a long time. And then something happened that he had not expected. Nothing. No surge of panic. No flood of adrenaline, no racing heart, no desperate scramble to act before the situation became irretrievable. What he felt instead was a calm so complete it surprised him, a stillness that sat in his chest like a stone settling to the bottom of a clear lake. He had prepared for this, not consciously perhaps, not in the way you prepare for something you believe will happen, but in the deeper way. The way a mind prepares for the thing it already knows is inevitable, even when it refuses to admit it. The boy had no money, no knowledge of the surrounding area, no history here, no connections, no map in his mind of where anything was or how to get there. He was wearing a dinner jacket and formal trousers in the middle of a small town on a Tuesday morning. He could not have gone far. Cresswell put on his coat and followed. The woods behind the property were old and dense and quiet in the way that woods are quiet when nothing has disturbed them in a long time. But the boy had disturbed them. The trail was visible, not dramatically, not like something out of a story, but in the small, specific ways that a body moving quickly through undergrowth leaves its evidence. A branch bent at an angle it wouldn't naturally hold. A patch of moss scuffed from the surface of a rock. A footprint pressed into a stretch of soft earth beside a fallen log, the edges still sharp, the impression still fresh. Cresswell followed it without hurry. The path moved through the trees in a roughly consistent direction northwest, toward the edge of town. The boy had known somehow which way to go, or had simply guessed correctly, or had seen a road from the window and aimed for it the way a drowning person aims for light. It didn't matter. What mattered was where it led. The woods thinned. The light changed, broadened, flattened, lost the green-filtered quality of deep shade and became the open, unfiltered brightness of a street in morning sun. Cresswell stepped out of the tree line and onto the sidewalk, and the town opened up before him in all its ordinary, unhurried Tuesday morning life. Shops with their doors propped open, a woman carrying groceries to her car, a dog lying in a patch of sunlight outside a hardware store, too warm to move. And there, across the street, the police station. Its doors were glass, and through them, visible even from this distance, a figure in a dark dinner jacket was disappearing inside. Cresswell stopped walking. He stood on the opposite side of the street, in the shadow of a building whose name he didn't bother to read, and felt something he had not felt in a very long time. Uncertainty. Not about the boy, not about what the boy would say. Cresswell had a reasonable idea of that. The boy would tell the truth, or his version of it, the truth as he understood it, filtered through months of trauma and silence and a mind that had been systematically dismantled and rebuilt, and was now, in this moment, trying desperately to reassemble itself from the wreckage. The uncertainty was about whether anyone would believe him. A young man walks into a police station, says he has been held captive, says his face has been surgically altered, says he has been forced, through months of pain and isolation and 100 small acts of violence to become someone else entirely. Says his name is not the name on any document in the world. Says he has no family, no history, no proof of anything except the body he is standing in. And even that body, the one thing that should be evidence, has been transformed beyond recognition. What does a police officer do with a story like that? Cresswell waited, across the street, in the shadow, watching the glass doors the way someone watches a door they know will eventually open and are not entirely sure they want it to. 20 minutes passed. Officers moved in and out on ordinary business, coffee cups in hand, radios crackling with the small, mundane frequencies of a town that had nothing happening in it. No one moved quickly. No one looked urgent. No one carried the particular tension in their body that comes from having just heard something that changed the shape of their afternoon. 30 minutes. A woman in civilian clothes entered, exited 5 minutes later with a manila folder, carried it to her car as though it contained nothing more interesting than a form that needed signing. 45 minutes. The door opened again, and this time a sergeant emerged, not quickly, not with any visible change in the rhythm of his morning. He stepped onto the sidewalk, paused, and scanned the street with the casual, practiced sweep of someone who has done this 10,000 times. His eyes moved across the storefronts, the parked cars, the patch of sidewalk where a dog was still sleeping in the sun. They found Cresswell and held. The sergeant crossed the street with an ease that carried authority in it, the way a river carries current, not visible on the surface, but unmistakable if you put your hand in. He stopped at a distance that was close enough to be direct and far enough to be polite, and regarded Cresswell with an expression that was not suspicious, exactly, but was not entirely neutral either. The expression of someone assembling a puzzle and waiting for the last piece to confirm what he already suspects. He spoke quietly, conversationally, the way someone might discuss the weather if the weather had been slightly unusual. There was a young man inside, the sergeant said. He had come in about 40 minutes ago. He had made a claim, a significant one. He said he had been held against his will. He said he had been surgically altered. He said he had been forced to look like someone he was not, and to become someone he was not, and that the man responsible was somewhere nearby. The sergeant paused, let the words settle. The story, he continued, was being treated as a mental health event. The young man had given his name as Rooker. He had insisted quietly, persistently, with a kind of exhausted conviction, that he had been hitchhiking when he was taken, that everything that had happened to him since then had been done without his consent and without his knowledge of why. But when pressed for details, when asked for anything that could be verified, anything that could be checked against the records of a life actually lived, the young man had provided nothing. No family, no friends, no employer, no address. No one in the world, it seemed, who knew he existed or would notice if he stopped. The sergeant's tone carried in it, beneath the professionalism, a kind of gentle skepticism. The tone of a man who had sat across from people in crisis before, who had listened to stories that felt, to the person telling them, like the truest thing they had ever said, and who had learned, over years of doing this, that the truest feeling stories were not always the true ones. Cresswell listened to all of this, and then he did what he had planned to do, months ago, in the quiet architecture of his own mind, for exactly this moment. He expressed concern. His voice carried in it the weight of a father worried, slightly embarrassed, deeply familiar with this particular kind of crisis. He explained calmly that this was his son, that his name was Sebastian, that Sebastian had a history, a long history, well documented, well known to the people who had treated him of mental health struggles. Episodes, breaks, moments in which the boundary between what was real and what Sebastian believed to be real became, for Sebastian, indistinguishable. The sergeant nodded, asked for identification. Cresswell reached into his coat pocket and produced a passport. Sebastian's passport. He handed it to the sergeant with the practiced ease of someone who has carried this document for months, turning it over in his mind, preparing for exactly this exchange. The sergeant opened it, looked at the photograph, looked up, looked back down at the photograph. The resemblance, the extraordinary, painstaking, 11 hours of surgery resemblance, was unmistakable. The face in the passport and the face the sergeant had been looking at for the past 40 minutes were, by any visible measure, the same face. He closed the passport, handed it back. And then he asked, almost as an afterthought, almost as though it had just occurred to him, whether Cresswell wanted to press charges. The young man inside had, after all, left the property without permission, had taken clothes, had, in a technical sense, stolen from him. Cresswell shook his head. No charges. He simply wanted his son back. He wanted to make sure Sebastian received the care he needed, the proper care, the kind of care that a father provides when his son is struggling and the world outside doesn't understand, and the only thing left to do is bring him home and hold the door closed until the storm passes. The sergeant studied Cresswell's face for a moment, the kind of look that a man gives another man when he is deciding, in real time, whether to trust him. And somewhere inside the station, behind glass doors and fluorescent lights, and a desk where a young man in a borrowed dinner jacket sat with his hands folded in his lap, and his new face perfectly still in his eyes, those wary, ancient, endlessly watchful eyes, fixed on a point in the middle distance, waiting to see what the world was going to do with him next. The name Rooker sat in the air like smoke, like something that had been spoken aloud for the first time in a very long while, and had not yet disappeared. The sergeant's face did something subtle then, a softening around the eyes, a slight loosening of the jaw, the kind of shift that happens when a person's professional distance gives way just briefly to something more human. Sympathy, not suspicion, not doubt. Sympathy, the look of a man who has seen fathers worry before and recognizes the shape of it, even when the worry is quiet and controlled and doesn't raise its voice. He told Cresswell to wait inside. The lobby was small and unremarkable, the kind of space designed to be functional rather than comfortable, with plastic chairs arranged against a wall, and a bulletin board covered in flyers that no one read, and a fluorescent light overhead that buzzed at a frequency, just low enough to be felt rather than heard. Cresswell sat in one of the chairs and folded his hands in his lap and waited. Through the glass partition, a single panel of reinforced transparency that separated the waiting area from the corridor beyond, he could see the boy. Sitting still, in Sebastian's dinner jacket, which had not wrinkled, which had not shifted from its position on the boy's shoulders since the moment it was put on that morning. The posture was perfect, back straight, shoulders level, hands resting on his knees with a stillness that looked, from the outside, like composure, like the practiced calm of someone who has learned to hold themselves together in public spaces. But Cresswell knew it wasn't composure. It was something else, something quieter and more terrible. The stillness of someone who has tried, genuinely, desperately tried to be heard, and has discovered that the world on the other side of the glass does not have the equipment to hear him. 20 minutes passed. The door to the corridor opened, and a woman emerged, not in uniform, but carrying herself with the particular kind of authority that comes from training rather than rank. a crisis counselor. She crossed the lobby toward Cresswell with a folder in one hand and an expression on her face that was professional and warm and entirely, completely wrong in ways she could not have known. She explained in the measured, careful tone of someone delivering a verdict she has delivered many times before, what she had found. The young man was experiencing significant psychological distress. That much was clear. The nature of the distress, however, was not what he had described. It was not captivity. It was not surgical alteration. It was not, in any clinically meaningful sense, a reflection of something that had actually happened to him. What it was, what the counselor believed, based on her assessment, based on the particular pattern of the boy's claims and the particular quality of his conviction, was a dissociative episode, an identity confusion, deep and sincere, in which the boy had constructed a narrative around his distress that felt, to him, absolutely real, but did not correspond to any observable reality. Paranoid delusions about surgical alteration, she said. The phrase landed in the lobby like something dropped from a height. She continued, he was not suicidal, he was not violent. He posed no immediate risk to himself or others. A medical examination had revealed no signs of recent trauma, no scarring consistent with the procedures he had described, no evidence of the captivity he had claimed. His body, the counselor noted, appeared healthy, well-maintained even. She recommended outpatient psychiatric treatment, therapy, possibly medication, a slow, supported process of working through whatever had brought him to this point. Cresswell listened to every word, nodded at the appropriate moments, asked one or two questions, quiet, concerned, the questions a father asks when a professional is explaining something frightening about his child. He thanked her. She smiled, the kind of smile that professionals smile when they believe they have helped, and disappeared back through the door. And Cresswell sat in the plastic chair, and the fluorescent light buzzed above him, and somewhere on the other side of that glass partition, a boy who had told the truth sat perfectly still and waited to be returned to the man who had taken everything from him. The sergeant brought him out quietly. No drama, no escort, no sense of occasion or significance. Just a young man in formal clothes walking through a door, his wrists free, his hands at his sides, his face arranged into an expression of such careful neutrality that it could have been mistaken for calm by anyone who wasn't looking closely enough to see what lived underneath it. Cresswell stood, and their eyes met. Across the small, unremarkable distance of a police station lobby, with its plastic chairs and its fluorescent hum and its bulletin board full of things no one reads, something passed between them. Not a word, not a gesture. Something older than language, a recognition, mutual and instantaneous, of exactly where they both stood. The boy had tried. He had reached for the one institution the world offers to people who are in danger, and he had told it the truth, and the truth had been received as illness, as delusion, as the sad, confused story of a mind that had broken under its own weight. It had not worked, and in the boy's eyes, beneath the neutrality, beneath the carefully held stillness, Cresswell saw something settle, not resignation, not quite, something more precise than that, an exhausted recognition, quiet and final, that this particular door had closed, that this particular avenue of escape had led not to freedom, but to a room where a woman with a clipboard had looked at him with sympathy and written down the wrong thing. The boy walked toward Cresswell without hesitation, without flinching, without any visible change in his posture or his breathing or the set of his jaw. He simply walked, the way someone walks toward something they have already accepted, and stood beside Cresswell, and waited to be told what happened next. The drive back was silence. Not the silence of the early days, not the enforced, gagged medical silence of a body that has been told it must not make sound. This was different. This was the silence of someone who has decided, for reasons of their own, that there is nothing left worth saying. The boy sat in the passenger seat with his hands folded in his lap and his eyes fixed on the road ahead and his face perfectly, utterly still. The landscape moved past the window, bare trees giving way to the first tentative green of spring. The road curving through hills that Sebastian had driven this same road 100 times, and the boy watched none of it, or watched all of it. There was no way to tell. Cresswell did not speak. For once he did not fill the silence. He let it sit between them, heavy and undisturbed, all the way back to the house. That evening, while the boy sat in his room with the particular, motionless quality of someone who has gone somewhere inside himself that the outside world cannot reach, Cresswell moved through the house with quiet, purposeful efficiency. Motion sensors, installed in the hallways at the top of the stairs, near every window and every door. Small, discreet, almost invisible, the kind of technology that disappears into the architecture of a space and becomes part of it without announcing itself. Locks, new ones on doors that had previously been secured with older, simpler mechanisms. These required keys, keys that lived in Cresswell's pocket and only in Cresswell's pocket. Monitoring systems. Cameras placed at angles that covered every possible path from inside the house to outside it. Every window, every door, every point where the boundary between the sealed world Cresswell had built and the open world beyond it could be breached. The boy watched him install them. Not from a distance, from his chair in the room where the work was being done, with his eyes following Cresswell's hands as they attached sensors to door frames and threaded cables behind the baseboards. He watched with an expression that had become, by now, so neutral it was almost a kind of face in itself, a mask so practiced, so thoroughly worn that it had begun to replace whatever had been underneath it. No anger, no defiance, no visible response of any kind to what was happening around him. He simply watched and said nothing. His silence had become, by now, something more than the absence of speech. It had become a presence, a weight in every room he occupied, a density in the air around him that Cresswell could feel the way you feel a change in atmospheric pressure before a storm. The boy had stopped speaking not because he couldn't, and not because he had been told not to. He had stopped because he had discovered, in a plastic chair in a police station lobby, that speaking changed nothing. And so he had gone quiet, completely, absolutely, in a way that felt, to Cresswell, less like surrender and more like something far more dangerous. Patience. The protocols resumed, and this time they resumed with an intensity that left no room for anything else. 8 hours of piano, every day. The repertoire expanded not into easier territory but deeper into it. More complex pieces. Works that demanded not just technical precision but stamina, endurance, the kind of sustained physical and mental effort that pushes the body to the edge of what it can sustain and then asks it to keep going. The boy played all of it. Every note, every passage, every demanding, intricate sequence of sound that Cresswell placed before him. Without error, the fingers moved with a precision that bordered on mechanical, each note landing exactly where it was supposed to land, each transition executed with the smooth, unhesitating certainty of something that has been rehearsed 10,000 times. The technique was, by any objective standard, extraordinary. The kind of technique that takes years to build, even with the best instruction, even with natural talent, even with a body that is perfectly suited to the demands of the instrument. But the soul was still missing. It had not returned during the months of forced practice. It had not been coaxed out by Cresswell's demonstrations, or by the recordings of Sebastian playing, or by any of the 100 small interventions Cresswell had attempted to bridge the gap between mechanical competence and genuine musical expression. The boy played the way a machine plays, faithfully, precisely, correctly, and the music that came out of it was beautiful in the way that a photograph of a sunset is beautiful. It contained all the right elements. It was simply missing the thing that made it alive. In May, Cresswell made the call. The performance was scheduled for an evening recital at a venue he knew well, a hall that hosted regular concerts, intimate in scale, the kind of space where 80 people could sit close enough to a piano to hear not just the notes but the breath between them. It was the right size, the right audience, the right moment. The performance would do three things. It would reintroduce Sebastian to the community, to the faces and the names and the social geography of a world that had mourned him and moved on and would now have to be convinced to welcome him back. It would demonstrate publicly that Sebastian's mental state had recovered, that whatever had been wrong was now, or appeared to be, right, and it would establish credibility, the kind of credibility that makes the next step possible, the step after that. The steps that followed, one after another, into a life that Cresswell was building not just for the boy but for himself. On the evening of the performance, Cresswell drove them through the spring dusk. The light was doing what spring light does in this part of the world, falling sideways through the trees in long, golden shafts that turned the road into something almost theatrical. The boy sat in the passenger seat and stared out the window, and his face, in profile, lit and shadowed by the passing trees, looked exactly like Sebastian's face had looked in the evenings of his childhood, when Cresswell used to drive him home from lessons, and the boy would sit exactly like this, silent, turned toward the glass, watching the world move past without seeming to see it. The resemblance in that light was almost unbearable. The hall was warm and wood-paneled and smelled of old carpet and candle wax, and the particular, invisible accumulation of years of music having been played inside it. The piano sat on the small stage at the front, a grand, dark, polished and waiting, the way instruments wait, with a patience that has no bottom. Cresswell entered first, and the room noticed him. Not all at once, not with any dramatic shift in the atmosphere, but in the small, specific ways that rooms notice things, a head turning here, a conversation pausing there, two people exchanging a look that carried in it everything they were thinking but would not say out loud. Faces Cresswell recognized, former colleagues, members of the Historical Society, neighbors who had attended Sebastian's childhood recitals, who had watched him grow up, who had stood at his memorial and said the things people say when someone young and talented disappears too soon. They whispered among themselves as the boy entered behind him. Not loudly, not obviously, but the whispers were there, a low, continuous murmur that moved through the room like wind through grass, carrying fragments of sentences that Cresswell did not need to hear to understand. Is that really? And he looks exactly like. And but they said he was. The boy did not look at any of them. He walked to the piano with a directness that carried in it none of the hesitation you might expect from someone who had not performed in public ever. Not once. Not in any context. He simply walked, the way Sebastian used to walk into a room, as though the room had been waiting for him and was glad he had arrived. He sat, adjusted the bench by a fraction of an inch, placed his hands on the keys, and waited. Cresswell had chosen the program carefully. Nothing adventurous, nothing that would draw attention to itself, or demand the kind of emotional depth that might expose the absence at the center of the boys playing. A ballad, a moonlit piece, gentle and familiar, the kind of music that audiences have heard 100 times and will hear 100 times again and will always find beautiful. A prelude spare, quiet, requiring precision more than passion. Safe choices. Choices designed to let the technique shine, without asking the soul to show up. The boy began to play, and the sounds that filled the hall were perfect. Every note landed where it was supposed to land. Every phrase moved with the correct shape, the correct weight, the correct degree of dynamic shading. The fingers moved across the keys with an ease that looked effortless. The way the best technique always looks effortless, even when it has been built from thousands of hours of bleeding fingertips and forced repetition, and a kind of suffering that no audience member in that room could have imagined. The music was beautiful, and something was wrong with it. Not in any way you could point to. Not in a missed note or a stumbled passage or a moment where the technical command faltered. The wrongness was underneath the beauty, beneath the surface, beneath the sound itself, in a place that most listeners couldn't quite locate, but that almost all of them could feel. A hollowness, an emptiness at the center of something that should have been full. The difference between music that is played and music that is inhabited. Between sound produced by hands and sound produced by a person. The audience listened with polite attention, hands folded in laps, eyes on the boy's fingers as they moved. The kind of listening that people do when they are trying to enjoy something and are not entirely sure they can. Cresswell watched their faces from the back of the hall. He could see it in them, the slight furrow of the brow, the almost imperceptible shift in posture that happens when something doesn't quite add up. They sensed it, not consciously perhaps, not in words, but in the way that human beings sense the difference between a real thing and a copy of a real thing. Instinctively in the body, before the mind has time to name what it's feeling. Something was missing, and they couldn't say what it was. Intermission came, and the hall exhaled. The boy stood from the piano bench and moved to the side of the stage with the same quiet, unhurried composure he brought to everything. Cresswell moved through the crowd toward him, but before he reached the boy, he was intercepted. Gently, politely, by faces he knew. A woman from the Historical Society, her hand on his arm, her smile warm and careful, and carrying in it a question she was not yet ready to ask directly. A former colleague, glass of wine in hand, nodding in the direction of the stage with an expression that was trying very hard to be enthusiastic and was not quite succeeding. And then the questions began. Carefully worded, gently delivered, the kind of questions that people ask when they want to know something but have decided in advance to accept whatever answer they are given. How had Sebastian been found? Where had he been all this time? Was he, and here the questions became softer, more tentative, as though the askers were afraid of the answers. Was he well? Cresswell held his ground and began very carefully to answer. The questions came one after another, and Cresswell answered them the way a surgeon answers questions about a procedure, with precision, with calm, with the particular kind of confidence that comes from having rehearsed every word long before the moment arrived. Where had Sebastian been? Abroad, struggling, isolated by choice, not by force. A mental health crisis that had kept him hidden from the world for longer than anyone should have to be hidden. But he was back now. He was here. He was better. The words landed where they were supposed to land. The faces received them with the particular expression that polite people wear when they are not entirely convinced but have decided, for the sake of the evening, not to press the point. A skeptical politeness, the social equivalent of a door left slightly ajar, not closed, not open, simply not quite shut. Cresswell smiled, thanked them for asking, and moved on before the questions could deepen. The second half of the performance was exactly what the first half had been. Perfect, empty, beautiful in the way that a glass ornament is beautiful, catching the light, holding its shape, containing nothing inside it. The boy played every note with the same mechanical faithfulness, the same hollow precision, the same total absence of the thing that separates music from the mere production of sound. And the audience listened and applauded at the end, and filed out of the hall with expressions on their faces that suggested they had witnessed something unusual without quite being able to say what it was. Not impressive, not exactly, but not dismissible either. Something in between, something that would be remembered not as a triumph but as a question mark, a thing that needed watching. The weeks that followed were a series of tests, each one smaller than the last but no less consequential. Dinner with the Historical Society Board. Afternoon tea with families who had known Sebastian since childhood, who had watched him grow up in this town, who had praised him at school events and congratulated him at milestones and mourned him, publicly and genuinely, when he was gone. A reception at the country club, where the light was golden and the champagne was cold, and the conversations moved in the particular, careful circles that conversations move in when everyone in the room is thinking about the same thing, and no one is willing to be the first to say it. Each event was a test, and the boy passed each one. He shook hands with the correct pressure, firm enough to signal presence, gentle enough to signal ease. He maintained eye contact at the right moments and looked away at the right moments, in the way that people who are socially fluent do without thinking about it. When questions were directed at him, he answered them vaguely, pleasantly, with the kind of non-committal warmth that deflects curiosity without appearing to deflect it. "Oh, it's good to be back. Thank you for asking. Yes, it's been a long time." But he never started a conversation. Not once, not in any of these rooms, among any of these people, did the boy reach out and initiate an exchange. Did he offer an opinion, ask a question, make a joke, or do any of the hundred small, invisible things that people do when they are genuinely present in a social space? He responded. He did not originate. He was, in every interaction, a mirror reflecting back exactly what was directed at him, adding nothing of his own. Sebastian had been the opposite of this. Sebastian had been the person who filled rooms, who drew conversations toward himself the way gravity draws objects toward a center, who had an opinion about everything and the intellectual confidence, sometimes arrogance, to share it without hesitation or apology. The absence of this quality in the boy was noticeable. It was, in fact, the single most visible difference between the person sitting in Sebastian's chair and the person who had once occupied it. People remarked on it, not with suspicion, with something softer, something that Cresswell recognized immediately as an opportunity. "He seems so much calmer now," they said, "so much more at peace." And Cresswell nodded and smiled, and encouraged this interpretation, the way a gardener encourages a vine to grow in a particular direction. Gently, persistently, without drawing attention to the fact that he was doing it at all. "Yes," he said, "he's come a long way." June arrived, and with it, something Cresswell had been waiting for longer than he had admitted to himself. The death certificate had been challenged, not dramatically, not through any public spectacle or legal battle that might have drawn attention, quietly, through the proper channels, through the careful, methodical work of paperwork and signatures, and the particular kind of bureaucratic patience that Cresswell had always possessed. The challenge had been made on the grounds of insufficient evidence. The original identification had been, after all, based on circumstances that could be questioned. And the system, presented with a living man who bore an unmistakable resemblance to the man it had declared dead, had done what systems do when confronted with evidence they cannot ignore. It had revised its conclusion. Sebastian Cresswell was, once again, legally alive. The bank accounts were unfrozen. The trust fund, the money that had been set aside years ago by people who had believed in Sebastian's future, became accessible. The estate, which had been hemorrhaging toward foreclosure for months, was suddenly, quietly solvent again. The financial crisis that had forced Cresswell to accelerate the timeline, to push the boy into the world before he was truly ready, was over. The house could breathe again. And Cresswell, sitting alone in the dining room that evening with a glass of Sebastian's wine and the portraits watching from the walls, allowed himself something he had not permitted in a very long time. A moment of stillness, a moment in which he simply sat and looked at what he had built and let the weight of it settle into his bones. But something was happening to the boy. It began small, so small that Cresswell might have missed it entirely if he had not been watching, if he had not been, as he always was, paying the kind of attention to the boy that a scientist pays to an experiment that has begun to behave in ways the hypothesis did not predict. The boy would stop, mid-practice, mid-phrase. His hands would freeze on the keys, not from fatigue, not from pain, not from any physical cause that Cresswell could identify. They would simply stop moving, and the boy's eyes would go somewhere not blank exactly, but distant, focused on a point that existed not in the room, but somewhere deeper, somewhere interior, somewhere that Cresswell could not see or reach or understand. He would stay like that for 10 seconds, 15, sometimes 30, and then his hands would resume exactly where they had left off, as though the interruption had never happened. And at night, this was the detail that made something cold and formless stir in the back of Cresswell's mind. The boy spoke in his sleep. Not nonsense, not the incoherent murmurings of dreams. He spoke names, Sebastian's name most often, spoken with a clarity and an emphasis that suggested it was not being recalled but encountered, as though the boy was hearing it for the first time, over and over, in some interior space where sleep had lowered all the walls. Cresswell increased the medication. Not dramatically, not in any way that would have been visible to the boy or to anyone observing from the outside. He simply added to the existing regimen a small adjustment, a careful calibration, the kind of fine-tuning that a physician makes when the dosage is not quite producing the desired effect. The boy accepted the pills without comment, without resistance, without any visible acknowledgement that they existed. But the fragmentation continued. It did not stop. It did not even slow. If anything, it deepened, became more frequent, more pronounced, more difficult to dismiss as fatigue or stress or any of the ordinary explanations that Cresswell might have reached for if he had not, by now, run out of ordinary explanations. And then, one evening in late June, the boy looked up from his dinner and said something that made Cresswell's hand, holding a fork, go perfectly, absolutely still. "Father," the boy said. Just the word, quietly, simply, with none of the weight or irony or significance that the word might have carried in another context. He said it the way someone says good morning, automatically, reflexively, as a piece of social grammar that belongs to the structure of a conversation without carrying any particular meaning of its own. Sebastian had never used that word. Not once. Not in 20 years of living in this house, eating at this table, breathing the same air as the man who had raised him. Sebastian had called him Cresswell, had addressed him when he addressed him at all by his surname, with a distance that was not quite coldness but was not in any sense warmth. The word father had not existed in Sebastian's vocabulary. It had been in their household a word that belonged to other families, other arrangements, other kinds of love. And now the boy had said it, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. July 20th, 20 years to the day since Sebastian had left. Cresswell had been planning this evening for weeks, not with the anxious, obsessive attention he brought to surgical procedures, but with something quieter, something that felt, if he examined it too closely, uncomfortably close to anticipation. He wanted to fill this house with people again. He wanted to see it the way it had been before the silence, before the emptiness, before the years of solitary dinners and unwashed china, and the slow, creeping decay of a life lived entirely inside its own walls. He wanted, in other words, to celebrate. The invitations went out with care, not to everyone, only to those who mattered, the remaining members of the social circle, the people who had known Sebastian well enough to notice his absence and who would notice now his return. The dining room was prepared with an attention to detail that bordered on reverence, the china polished, the crystal set, the flowers arranged in the particular way that Sebastian's mother had once arranged them, decades ago, before any of this had begun. The guests arrived in the early evening, carrying with them the particular energy of people who are trying very hard to enjoy themselves and are not entirely sure they are succeeding. They took their seats around the long table, the same table that had sat empty for 2 years, that had accumulated dust in the spaces between the place settings, that had begun to feel less like furniture and more like a monument to something that had ended. They made polite conversation. They complimented the food. They carefully, skillfully, avoided asking any of the questions that were clearly present in the room, hovering just beneath the surface of every exchange like fish beneath the surface of dark water. The boy sat at the head of the table, in Sebastian's chair, in Sebastian's clothes, with Sebastian's posture and Sebastian's hands folded beside Sebastian's plate. He ate in silence through the first course, the soup, delicate and warm, served in the bowls that had been Sebastian's grandmother's. His face was composed. His eyes moved occasionally from one guest to another, following the conversation the way someone follows a film in a language they understand but do not speak. And then, during the main course, he opened his mouth. No one had asked him a question. No one had turned to him or included him or created any opening in the conversation that might have invited him to speak. He simply spoke, unprompted, unannounced, into a moment of silence between two sentences, the way a bird might sing into a gap between clouds naturally, without regard for whether the moment was appropriate or whether anyone was listening. He was describing a memory. Sailing, on the lakes nearby, the ones that sat in the valley like dark mirrors, reflecting the hills and the sky with a stillness so complete it was almost eerie. He described the water not in general terms, not in the vague, poetic language of someone who has read about water but never truly seen it, but in specific terms. The particular shade of gray-green it turned at dusk, the way it moved almost imperceptibly when the wind shifted direction, the sound it made against the hull of a small boat, a quiet, rhythmic tapping like fingers on wood that went on and on without pause. He described the light, the way it fell across the surface of the lake in the last hour before sunset, not golden, not orange, but something in between, something that didn't have a name but that you would recognize immediately if you had ever seen it. The way it changed, minute by minute, as the sun moved lower and the shadows lengthened and the whole landscape began slowly to dissolve into something darker and quieter and more ancient than itself. He described the wind in the sails, the sound of it not loud, not dramatic, but present. A continuous, low, almost musical note that filled the space around the boat and made everything else, the water, the light, the distant shore, feel smaller by comparison. The table had gone quiet. Not the polite quiet of people waiting for a pause in the conversation. The held quiet of people who are listening to something they did not expect to hear and are not entirely sure how to respond to. Glasses paused halfway to lips. Forks rested on plates. Eyes moved, almost unconsciously, toward the boy at the head of the table, toward this face that was Sebastian's face, speaking with Sebastian's voice, describing an experience that sounded, that felt entirely, undeniably real. Cresswell listened too, and felt something cold begin to move through the center of his chest. He had not put this memory there. He had not described sailing to the boy, had not shown him photographs of the lakes, or played recordings of wind against water, or narrated any scene that might have provided the raw material for what the boy was now producing. This was not installed. This was not constructed from the information Cresswell had fed him over months of careful, deliberate narrative building. This had come from somewhere else, from somewhere inside the boy, from a place Cresswell had not mapped, had not anticipated, had not accounted for in any of the careful calculations he had made before beginning this work. The boy's mind, the mind Cresswell had spent months dismantling and rebuilding and reshaping into something new, was generating its own material, was filling in the gaps, the silences, the empty spaces in the fabricated life with its own content, content that felt true, that carried in it the weight and texture and specificity of genuine memory, even though no such memory existed. The guests received the story with polite interest. A few smiled. One woman, an older woman, someone who had known Sebastian since he was small, nodded slowly, as though the story confirmed something she had always believed about him. No one challenged it. No one said, "I don't think that ever happened." They simply listened and let it settle and moved on to the next course, and the conversation resumed its ordinary, careful flow around the edges of the table. But the boy did not stop. Throughout the remainder of dinner, he spoke again, and again, each time unprompted, each time with the same quiet, unhurried certainty, as though he were not telling stories but simply reporting on things he knew to be true. Childhood memories, school experiences, a family trip to somewhere coastal, where the air tasted of salt and the days were long and warm, and something about the quality of the light made everything feel possible. Some of these stories Cresswell recognized. Fragments of actual events from Sebastian's life, things that had happened, things that existed in photographs or in Cresswell's own memory, things that the boy could have absorbed from the environment of this house, from the photographs on the walls, from the books on the shelves, from the thousand small traces that a life leaves behind when it ends. But others were entirely new. Stories Cresswell had never heard, events he could not place in any timeline he knew, details so specific, so textured, so alive with the particular weight of lived experience that they felt in the gut, in the place where intuition lives before the mind has time to analyze it real, not fabricated, not assembled from borrowed parts, real in the way that only genuine memory is real. The evening ended with what Cresswell would later describe in his journal as ambiguous success. The guests departed in good spirits. The conversation had gone well. The boy had performed admirably, had done, in fact, something no amount of coaching or rehearsal could have produced. He had become, for for the length of a dinner convincing. Not technically convincing, human convincing. The kind of convincing that comes from the inside out, from a place that cannot be faked. And that was precisely what frightened Cresswell. After the last car had pulled away, and the sound of engines had faded into the night, and the house had settled back into the silence it had worn for so long, Cresswell returned to the dining room to begin clearing the table. The boy was still there, sitting in Sebastian's chair, hands folded, eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the far wall, not blank, not dissociated, but thoughtful, present in a way he had not been present in months, as though something had opened in him during the evening and had not yet closed. Cresswell stopped in the doorway and watched. The boy's lips moved, and then he spoke, not to anyone in particular, not with any visible awareness that Cresswell was standing 3 feet away listening to every word. He spoke the way someone speaks when they are confirming something to themselves, verifying it, making sure it is true before they allow themselves to believe it. "I remember it," the boy said. His voice was quiet, steady, carrying in it a certainty that had not been there before, a certainty that did not come from performance or compliance or the careful mimicry of a mind that had been told what to say. It came from somewhere deeper, somewhere that Cresswell had not built and could not reach. The water, the boats, all of it. He looked up then, met Cresswell's eyes across the table, and in his expression, in the particular quality of that look, steady and unafraid and carrying in it something that Cresswell could only describe later as ownership, the careful architecture of months of work began, very quietly, to crack. The memories did not stop. Over the weeks that followed, they multiplied, proliferated, grew in number and in specificity, and in the quiet, persistent conviction with which the boy delivered them. He spoke about Sebastian's childhood with an authority that no amount of coaching could have produced, describing birthday parties with the kind of sensory detail that suggested he had been there, in the room, feeling the warmth of the candles and the sound of laughter and the particular, sharp sweetness of cake on the tongue. He described school friendships, names Cresswell had never mentioned, incidents that had left no trace in any document or photograph or record. He described conversations, family conversations, quiet and intimate, the kind that happen late at night in kitchens, and that no one writes down and no one remembers except the people who were present. Some of these things might have happened. Cresswell could not be sure. Sebastian's life had been long and full and poorly documented in the way that all lives are poorly documented. Most of it lived in the spaces between the records, in the moments that no one thought to preserve. It was possible that the boy had absorbed fragments of these moments from the environment, from the house, from the photographs, from the accumulated residue of a life that had been lived here, in these rooms, for decades. But it was also possible that something else was happening. Something Cresswell had not anticipated, had not planned for, had not, in all his careful calculations and all his meticulous control, accounted for. The boy's mind was not simply accepting the replacement identity. It was building on it, expanding it, filling in the spaces that Cresswell had left empty with material of its own, material that felt, to the boy, as real and as solid and as true as anything that had actually occurred. The mind, stripped of its original contents, had not remained empty. It had done what minds do when they are given a framework and left alone with it long enough. It had made it live. Cresswell sat with this understanding for a long time, turned it over, examined it from every angle, the way a surgeon examines an unexpected finding during a procedure, not with alarm, but with the careful, analytical attention of someone who needs to understand what is happening before he can decide what to do about it. Had he succeeded too completely? Had the dismantling been so thorough, the replacement so total, that the boy's mind had no choice but to fill the void with whatever it could find? Or was something stranger occurring, something that lived outside the boundaries of what Cresswell understood about minds and memory and the relationship between the two? He thought sometimes in the quiet hours about the word possession, not in any supernatural sense, not in the way the word is used in stories about demons and dark houses and things that go wrong in the night, but in a quieter, more unsettling sense. The sustained immersion in Sebastian's world, his belongings, his music, his physical space, the very air of rooms he had once breathed had created something. A kind of absorption so deep it had become, in some way Cresswell could not quite articulate, a transfer. As though Sebastian's life had not simply been a template, as though it had become, in some sense, contagious. August arrived with a heat that sat heavy on the landscape and made the house feel smaller than it was, and with it came an envelope. It bore the return address of the Berkshire County District Attorney's Office. Cresswell opened it at the kitchen table, with the morning light falling across the page in a way that felt, in retrospect, almost theatrical, as though the moment had been staged by someone with a talent for dramatic framing. The letter was brief, precise, written in the particular, careful language that legal offices use when they want to be understood without being threatening, though the threat was there, underneath every sentence, in the simple fact of what was being asked. An investigation had been opened, not into Sebastian, into the circumstances surrounding Sebastian's return. The circumstances, the particular pattern of events, the timeline, the questions that had been raised and not quite answered, had prompted concerns. Concerns that had been raised, the letter noted, by a crisis counselor who had assessed the boy in a police station lobby in March, and who had, in the weeks and months since, found herself unable to stop thinking about what she had seen that day. The letter requested that Cresswell and his son make themselves available for interviews. Cresswell set the letter down on the table and sat very still for a very long time. An official investigation meant questions. It meant scrutiny. It meant people, professionals, trained professionals, people whose job it was to look closely at things and find the places where they did not add up, turning their attention to the boy and to Cresswell and to the story that had held everything together since March. It meant, most dangerously, a medical examination. The scarring could be explained. Reconstructive surgery following an accident, that story existed, and it was plausible, and it could be supported by documentation that Cresswell could produce. The pattern of the scars was unusual, yes, but unusual was not impossible. Unusual was not proof. But dental records were another matter entirely. And DNA was another matter after that. The boy was not Sebastian, had never been Sebastian, and if anyone thought to compare what lived inside his mouth, or what lived inside his cells, to the records that existed for Sebastian Cresswell, the dental x-rays taken during childhood, the blood samples drawn during school physicals, the 1,000 small biological fingerprints that a person leaves behind simply by existing in a world that keeps track of such things. The whole edifice would fall. Cresswell picked up the letter again, read it one more time, set it down, and began, very carefully, to think about what came next. 14 days. That was the window he gave himself. 14 days to decide whether this fragile illusion would continue breathing, or be erased in a way that left no questions behind. Cresswell spent the first 3 days packing through possibilities, weighing silence against exposure, control against consequence. All the while, the boy moved through the house with clockwork regularity. Morning scales, afternoon walks, evening meals, not a single crack of doubt. Either he didn't sense the storm gathering, or he no longer cared. On the fourth morning, Cresswell chose transparency. He would open the doors, invite scrutiny, let officials examine every detail and draw their own conclusions. Not out of virtue, out of fear. Somewhere along the way, the experiment had crossed a line he never meant to approach. The transformation hadn't stopped at skin and habit. The boy hadn't just learned Sebastian's life, he had absorbed it. Memory, posture, instinct. Identity had settled into him like bone. Ending this now wouldn't be cleaning up a mistake. It would be killing someone who believed he had always existed. Not the nameless drifter from 6 months ago, but a son painstakingly brought back to life. When the investigators arrived, Cresswell greeted them in his study with a composure that bordered on serene. He spoke carefully. A recovered child, intensive therapy, voluntary procedures, trauma explained, gaps filled. He slid across a stack of medical files, perfectly constructed, flawlessly false. They listened, took notes, asked measured questions. Then they requested to speak with the boy alone. Cresswell watched from the study window as the boy sat upright in the music room, answering calmly, hands relaxed, voice steady. No tension in his shoulders, no guarded movements. He didn't just claim to be Sebastian. He knew it. 2 hours later, the investigators asked for a DNA sample. Standard procedure, they said. A formality to amend old records. The boy didn't hesitate, rolled up his sleeve, turned his face for the swab. After they left, Cresswell found him at the piano. The room was heavy with sound, low, aching phrases that seemed to sag under their own weight. The piece was slow, mournful, drawn out with a sensitivity Sebastian himself had never possessed. The boy played with his eyes shut, body swaying slightly, as if the music were carrying something personal to the surface. Cresswell sat in the green velvet chair and listened. The sadness in the room didn't feel composed. It felt remembered. As if the boy had found, inside those notes, a language for his own condition, reshaped beyond return, welcomed as someone else, cut off forever from the person he had once been. When the final chord faded, the boy looked at him. There was no blame there, no mercy either, just a tired understanding. A silent acknowledgement that whatever came next, they were no longer separate stories. The results arrived 3 weeks later in a plain envelope stamped with the state seal. Cresswell opened it alone, the sound of piano practice drifting faintly from the next room. He skimmed the report once, then again, slower this time, his training forcing clarity where his mind resisted it. The conclusion was absolute. The subject was not Sebastian Cresswell, but he was not a stranger. The genetic markers revealed lineage. 50% shared DNA with Sebastian, 25% with Cresswell himself. A grandson. Further records followed. A man named Sebastian Cresswell, dead from an overdose 7 years earlier. A 5-year-old boy placed into state care. Foster homes. Files. A name buried in paperwork. Rooker Cresswell. Disappeared at 18 into the drift of temporary jobs and borrowed couches across western towns. Statements resurfaced. Things the boy had said months earlier at a police station. Rambling, they thought. Fantasies born of stress. He had been looking for his father's family. He had traced an address, partial, outdated, to Gideon Cresswell. He had been walking toward this estate when Cresswell's car stopped. He hadn't been running from nowhere. He had been coming here, hopping to meet a grandfather, hopping for a connection he'd been denied since childhood. Cresswell read that section again and again. The boy hadn't been a coincidence. He had arrived seeking family, and Cresswell had answered by erasing the very person who came looking for it. He severed that hope by reshaping the boy into the echo of the man who had never stayed. Cresswell lowered the report, his fingers shaking now, the paper rattling softly against itself. The truth pressed down on him with crushing clarity. This was not resurrection. He had not rebuilt a son from absence. He had carved his dead child's likeness onto living flesh, onto the body of his grandson, and forced that boy to live inside a borrowed past. The resemblance hadn't been coincidence. It had been inheritance. The bones, the angles, the vulnerabilities woven into the nervous system, the same delicate fractures of mind that had undone Sebastian years ago were already present, waiting. Cresswell hadn't created something miraculous. He had created something unnatural. A child wearing his father's face like a ceremonial mask. From the music room, the piano continued, steady, unbroken, indifferent to revelation. Cresswell moved to the doorway and watched. Reflected above the keys, the face staring back at him was unmistakably Sebastian's, but the eyes were not. They held depth, awareness, a quiet grief Sebastian had never lived long enough or cared enough to develop. This was the man Sebastian might have become if life had humbled him, if pain had carved empathy where arrogance once lived. And suddenly, Cresswell understood. For the first time, he wasn't seeing the result of his work. He was seeing the boy he had destroyed to achieve it. The child had come searching for family, for some proof that he belonged to something larger than foster files and forgotten names. And Cresswell, confronted with his own failures as a father, had answered by erasing the last remaining trace of that boy's self. He had turned him into a replica of the son he had failed to save. The music stopped. The boy turned on the bench, studying Cresswell's face. Months of quiet observation had trained him to read the smallest shifts, the tension in shoulders, the silence held too long. He sensed it instantly. Something final had changed. Cresswell extended the report. The boy stood and approached, taking the pages in hands shaped to match another man's elegance. He read without reacting, line by line, explanation after explanation. The uncanny familiarity, the way his body had accepted alteration as if remembering itself. The memories that surfaced uninvited, half his, half not. When he finished, he looked up. There was no shock, no relief, only tired understanding. For 6 months, he had been molded into his father. His own identity dissolved under repetition and correction until nothing familiar remained. And now, he learned that the transformation had been written into him long before surgery, that he had always carried his father's face as a possibility. He opened his mouth. After weeks of silence, after endless performances of a life that wasn't his, he was finally ready to speak as himself, whatever fragments of that still existed. Cresswell braced for it. Anger, accusation, anything that proved a self still lived beneath the reconstruction. But the boy said nothing. He handed the report back, turned, and returned to the piano. His fingers found the exact place where he had stopped. The music resumed without hesitation, as though the revelation had altered nothing, or as though he had already stopped caring who he was meant to be. Cresswell stood frozen, the report hanging loosely from his hand, listening as his grandson played his father's music in his father's house with his father's hands. The sound was no longer beautiful. It was simply honest. The sound of someone who had lost not just identity, but the belief that identity mattered, that the boundary between self and other was worth protecting. Outside, snow began to fall, early, rare, but not unheard of. It settled quietly on the windowsill, each flake distinct for a moment before dissolving into the mass. Cresswell watched as the music continued behind him, knowing there was no resolution left to reach. He had made something that could neither be set free nor undone. The boy would remain here, playing borrowed memories, existing in a space language could not name. Not son, not grandson. Something else. The authorities would return. Papers would be filed. Conclusions drawn. But no ruling could touch what had truly occurred. No system accounted for a man who had turned his grandson into the living remainder of his father, who had made the dead persist by erasing the living. The final notes faded, hanging briefly in the cold air before disappearing. In the silence, there was only snow against glass and Cresswell's uneven breathing. The boy's hand stayed on the keys, motionless, as if awaiting instruction, like a life paused between past and present, in a house where time had stopped the day Sebastian left, and had only now begun to move again, quietly, irreversibly in the wrong direction.